Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It was around 2 in the afternoon when the phone rang. I had just finished my lunch and was sitting at my desk, scrolling through some emails. The sound of the phone vibrating against the wood of my table felt oddly out of place in the otherwise quiet apartment. I glanced at the caller ID. No name, just a long string of numbers, another telemarketer, I assumed. Hello? I picked up the phone without much interest. Good afternoon, is this Mr. Adam Turner? The voice on the other end was polite, too smooth, almost robotic, yet with a touch of warmth that didn't seem to belong to someone reading a script. Yes, speaking. I leaned back in my chair, wondering what kind of offer they were going to pitch this time. We're calling from Sunlight Solutions, and I'm pleased to inform you that you've been selected for an exclusive offer tailored just for you. The voice paused, and I could almost hear the smile behind the words. We've noticed you've been a loyal customer for over 2 years, and we would love to offer you a special discount on our new smart home system. I raised an eyebrow. Smart home systems weren't something I had ever shown interest in, let alone purchased. A quick search through my memory confirmed it. I had never been involved in any program like that. Sorry, but I'm not really looking for anything like that, I replied, half in disbelief. I don't think I've ever signed up for anything from Sunlight Solutions. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a soft click, as if the operator was checking something. Oh, but you did, Mr. Turner, the voice said, now more assured. You signed up a year ago, and we have all the records right here. There was another small pause. Your account was activated on May 10th of last year. You made the purchase directly from our website, remember? I blinked, trying to recall any transaction, but the name Sunlight Solutions didn't ring any bells. I couldn't think of a single time I bought anything online for my home. My mind raced, but I didn't want to seem confused or alarmed, so I forced a chuckle. You've got the wrong person. I don't know anything about this, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The voice on the other end didn't falter. Instead, it became softer, almost sympathetic. Mr. Turner, I assure you, our records are completely accurate. Perhaps you don't remember, but there are certain details that might help jog your memory. Another brief pause. For example, the transaction was made using your personal email address. And your shipping address, well, it's the same as it is now, right? The one where you're sitting right now? A cold shiver ran down my spine. The apartment, the one I had rented for the last 2 years, was indeed the one I was sitting in now, but the fact that they knew that with such certainty unnerved me. I'm sorry, but I think you've got the wrong guy, I muttered again, trying to brush it off. I've never bought anything from you, and I don't know what you're talking about. The silence on the other end grew longer, stretching out like a heavy weight. Then, just when I was about to hang up, the operator's voice came back, more insistent. I understand, Mr. Turner. But here's the thing. You've also recently inquired about our services in a survey. The voice continued, I'm sure you recall the survey we sent you 2 weeks ago about energy-efficient appliances for your home. You even left feedback, didn't you? You mentioned wanting to upgrade your kitchen lighting. I froze. The details it had provided were eerily precise. I had filled out a survey 2 weeks ago on my phone while sitting in the living room, no less. I had indeed mentioned that I wanted to upgrade my kitchen lighting, but how could they possibly know this? How do you know all this? My voice came out as a whisper, though I hadn't meant it to. Mr. Turner, we keep track of our clients' preferences to provide the best possible offers. Everything is for your convenience. The operator's tone was calm, almost too calm. Wouldn't you like to hear about the details of your offer? It could save you quite a bit on your next bill. I opened my mouth to say something, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the soft hum of the phone line, the quiet buzz in the background. It felt like the walls of the room were closing in on me, the air getting heavier with every word. But then, the voice on the other end shifted again. This time, it didn't sound like the polite, smooth operator anymore. It was darker, more personal. Mr. Turner, it said, we know about your recent struggles. The job you lost last month. The late-night drives around the city you've been taking. Your recurring thoughts about how lonely you've been since your last relationship ended. We know all of it, Adam. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a telemarketer anymore. They knew too much, things they shouldn't have known. And then, the real terror set in. How were they listening? I sat there, frozen, holding the phone like it was a live wire. The voice on the other end had stopped, but the words it had said kept echoing in my mind. We know all of it. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. The air felt thick, like I was suffocating. There was a deep, cold pit forming in my stomach. I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think straight. How could they possibly know about my personal life? The job loss? The late-night drives? It was as though they had been watching me. But there was no way, no possible way, they could have known such private details. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I was paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. Then, a soft noise cut through the silence, the faintest of clicks, like the sound of something shifting in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The static of the phone line maybe. But then it happened again, clear this time, a distinct, rhythmic sound, like footsteps. The noise came from outside my apartment, from the hallway. I stood up, suddenly aware of the emptiness around me. The air in my living room felt colder now, as though someone had turned the temperature down without me noticing. I glanced at the clock, 2:30 in the afternoon. The hallway outside my apartment should have been empty. I lived in a small building, just a few tenants, and nobody was supposed to be home at this hour. Yet, there it was again, another click. Then a shuffle. The footsteps were moving toward my door. I turned back to the phone. The voice had remained silent, but I could hear the faint breathing of the operator on the other end. It wasn't the same, calm breath as before. Now, it was shallow and quick, as though they were waiting for something. Waiting for me. Who are you? I managed to stammer, my voice shaking. How do you know this? The voice responded almost immediately, but this time it didn't sound like an operator at all. It was deeper. Almost distorted. We know everything, Mr. Turner. We've been watching you for quite a while. I heard the sound again, louder this time, just outside my door. A tap. A gentle knock, as if testing whether or not I would answer. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, my body moving on its own. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know whether it was the fear of the call or the sound coming from my front door, but I could feel every muscle in my body tensing. The voice continued, its tone strangely soothing yet undeniably sinister. "We're not the only ones who are watching, Adam. You've been observed for some time now. Everywhere you go, everything you do. You can't hide from us." I wanted to hang up. I needed to end the call, but my fingers wouldn't obey me. I was gripped by a deep, paralyzing fear that held me to the spot. My mind was a mess of confusion. How could they know? I never gave out personal details to anyone. I never even used social media, never shared anything online. The footsteps had stopped outside my door. The silence in the room seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating me. The shadows in the corners of the apartment began to stretch, elongating in the dim light of the afternoon. The floor creaked under the weight of invisible pressure. Another knock, louder this time. A quick, insistent rapping at the door. It echoed through the apartment, filling the space with a sense of dread. Suddenly, the voice on the phone grew urgent. "It's too late, Mr. Turner. We're already here." My pulse raced. I forced myself to turn, to move toward the door, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. My mind screamed for me to check the peephole, to see who was there, but my feet wouldn't carry me any closer. Then, just as I reached out to grab the handle of the door, the phone went silent. I looked down at the screen. The call had ended. I stood there, motionless, staring at the darkened screen of my phone. A part of me wanted to believe it was all a prank, a terrible joke. But something deep inside me told me that wasn't the case. The knocking had stopped. But the feeling of being watched, that feeling never went away. I turned slowly toward the window, hoping to see some sign of normality. Outside, the street was empty. No one was there. It was a quiet afternoon, just as it always had been. Yet, I couldn't shake the unease creeping through me. The unsettling thought kept repeating in my mind, "They're still out there. They're always watching." The phone call had ended, but the feeling of dread clung to me like a thick fog. I stood by the door for what felt like an eternity, frozen, waiting for the next sound to break the silence. But nothing came. The apartment felt unnaturally still, too still. I glanced toward the window again, hoping for any sign of normalcy, anything that would tell me this had been some kind of sick prank, but the street outside remained empty. The world beyond my apartment seemed distant, unreachable, as though it were part of a dream, a world I no longer belonged to. I slowly walked back to my desk, trying to steady my breath, but my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How had they known about me? Who were they? And what did they mean by watching? The phone vibrated on the desk again, pulling me from my thoughts. I jumped, almost knocking it off the edge. I glanced at the screen. The same number. My stomach twisted in knots. I almost didn't pick up. Almost. "Mr. Turner," the voice was back, but this time it was softer, almost too calm. "You're not alone." I froze, the blood draining from my face. I could hear it clearly now, slow, measured breaths, each one deliberate. A whisper, almost drowned out by the heavy silence in the room. "I know you're scared," the voice continued, "and you should be. There's nowhere to hide, Adam." I wanted to scream, to shout at them, to demand to know how they were doing this, but my throat was dry. My hands shook as I held the phone, its cold plastic surface slipping from my grip. A sudden noise cut through the air, sharp and jagged, something moving in the hallway. The floor creaked underfoot, just like before. But this time, it wasn't a distant sound. It was right outside my door, unmistakable. The shuffle of feet, slow and deliberate, as if someone was waiting for me to react. I snapped my head toward the door. My pulse thudded in my ears. Was someone out there? Had they somehow known exactly what I'd been expecting to call? The operator's voice broke through my thoughts, softer now, almost coaxing. You're not the first, Mr. Turner. You're just the latest. The footsteps outside the door grew louder, and this time I could hear them clearly, 2 distinct steps, one after the other. A pattern. A rhythm. They weren't random. Someone was out there, watching. Why are you doing this? I whispered, my voice trembling as I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. What do you want from me? The voice chuckled darkly. We're not the ones you need to worry about, Adam. The ones watching you are much closer. I could barely comprehend the words. My head spun as I turned to the door once again. My eyes flicked to the peephole. I hesitated, breath caught in my throat. What if they were there? What if this was some sick game, and opening the door would reveal something that would shatter everything I knew? I needed to know. I had to. I walked slowly toward the door, my feet dragging with each step. The room felt colder now. The walls seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching, forming long, dark shapes. Everything looked wrong. The familiar layout of the apartment, the place I'd lived in for so long, now felt like a trap. When I reached the door, I pressed my eye to the peephole. Nothing. No figure. No shadow. The hallway beyond was empty, just like before. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me from all sides. But then, as I turned away from the door, a faint scratching sound reached my ears. It came from inside the apartment, behind me. The sound of something moving, dragging along the floor. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. Nothing. The living room was empty. The windows shut tight, the furniture exactly as I had left it. But I could feel it, something was different. The air was heavier, thicker. A dark presence had filled the space, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was just out of sight, waiting. I turned back to the door. The knocking hadn't returned, but the oppressive silence was louder than ever. It weighed on me, pressing me into a corner, making me feel small, insignificant. The phone vibrated again in my hand, and I almost dropped it in my haste to answer. The same number. The same voice. Mr. Turner, it said, this time slower, almost a whisper. You're being watched. We know everything about you. You can't escape. The words hit me like a physical blow, the terror in my chest growing unbearable. I could feel the sweat on my brow, my heart racing. I needed to do something. Anything. Then, just as I opened my mouth to speak, the phone line cut out. The connection disappeared, leaving me with nothing but the distant sound of static. I could still hear it. The footsteps. And this time, they weren't just outside my door. They were inside the apartment. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps, heavy, deliberate, were no longer outside my door. They were coming from somewhere inside the apartment. The rhythmic sound echoed through the walls, each step like a slow drumbeat of doom. I turned in place, eyes darting around the room. My apartment, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a maze, every shadow a hiding place for something that shouldn't be there. The furniture, the walls, the very air seemed to bend with a growing sense of malice. I could hear the scraping again, a subtle noise, as though something was being dragged across the floor, closer and closer to me. I reached for the light switch, desperate for some clarity, some sign that I was simply losing my mind. But when I flicked it, the light overhead flickered once and then went out entirely, leaving the room bathed in shadow. I cursed under my breath, now plunged into total darkness. I took a step back, feeling around for anything that could help. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. It was like the walls were closing in, suffocating me. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, like a presence moving swiftly across the room, but no one was there. My hands trembled as I felt the edges of the coffee table, the couch, the walls. There was a distinct chill now, not from the air, but from something more unnatural, something cold and suffocating. I could almost feel the presence of something standing just beyond the reach of the darkness, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then the scratching sound returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the floor anymore. It was coming from the ceiling. The unmistakable noise of claws or fingernails scraping against wood, dragging slowly, deliberately. I gasped, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The noise moved, skittering, crawling, making its way across the ceiling, closer to where I stood. Every inch of my body screamed at me to run, to get out of the apartment, but my legs refused to move. The terror that gripped me kept me rooted to the spot. And then, the worst part, the silence. For a moment, everything went still. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as though the darkness itself was holding me captive. The footsteps, the scratching, everything stopped. It was in that moment, that all-consuming stillness, that I heard it. A whisper. Soft, barely audible. It came from behind me. Adam. My name. It was a quiet hiss, but it felt like it had been shouted directly into my ear. I spun around, panic rising in my throat. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the darkness pressing in on me. Who's there? I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. What do you want from me? The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, low, guttural, overlapping, and they all seemed to come from the shadows around me, surrounding me. We've been waiting, Adam. Waiting for you. The air grew colder, a biting chill creeping into my bones. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching longer, twisting unnaturally. I could feel them closing in, wrapping around me like an inescapable shroud. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The room was no longer just an apartment. It was a trap. Suddenly, the light flickered back on, only it wasn't the usual warm glow of my living room. The light was dim and flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I glanced around wildly, my eyes wide with fear, but everything in the apartment looked the same except for one thing. The door. The door, which had been shut when I last checked, was now ajar. Just slightly. As if someone had opened it without me knowing. I could feel the cold air from the hallway creeping into the apartment, carrying with it the distant sound of breathing. Slow. Steady. I turned toward the door, my body trembling with the weight of what I might find on the other side. I took a step forward, and the floor beneath me creaked loudly, as though it, too, was warning me not to go any further. But I couldn't stop. I had to know. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic. They no longer seemed distant. They were all around me, in the walls, in the air, closing in like a vice. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking so badly I almost couldn't grip it. I twisted it slowly, cautiously, as if afraid of what might be waiting for me. And then, just before I opened it, I heard a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It came from behind me, but when I whipped around, there was nothing. The apartment was still empty. Still. The thud came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor behind me. I spun back toward the door, my heart thudding so loudly in my chest I could barely hear the noises around me. The door was almost fully open now. The hallway outside was just as dark and quiet as before, but I could feel the weight of something watching me from the shadows beyond. I had a choice now. I could open the door and face whatever waited outside, or I could stay here, alone in the dark, with whatever was lurking behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but as I reached for the door once more, I heard it. The thing that pushed me over the edge. A voice. Not from the phone. Not from the shadows. But from the hallway. Adam. It was so close now. So close, it was right behind me. I didn't think. I just ran. My feet hit the floor with frantic, panicked steps, each stride desperate to escape whatever was waiting for me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The voice, soft and chilling, had come from directly behind me, so close that it felt like breath on the back of my neck. Adam. I sprinted down the hallway, heart hammering, hands outstretched, as though I could outrun the terror chasing me. I reached the front door, yanked it open, and burst into the hallway, nearly slamming the door behind me. But I didn't stop. I didn't care if anyone saw me or heard me. I just needed to get out. The apartment building was eerily silent. The hallways, usually full of the mundane sounds of daily life, now felt like an empty, lifeless cavern. The dim light of the hallway cast long, stretching shadows against the walls. Every creak, every shift of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed magnified, echoing in the silence like a warning. I ran down the stairs, taking them two at a time, my breath ragged, my body pushing itself beyond its limits. The door to the outside world was only a few floors away. I could feel the cold rush of night air waiting for me, the promise of escape just beyond the building's walls. But with every step I took, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps following me, matching my pace, never a step behind or ahead, but always just there, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Click. Click. I skidded to a halt at the bottom of the stairs, my hand outstretched toward the exit, the door that led to freedom. But when I reached for the handle, the door didn't open. It was locked. I pulled harder, frantic now, but the handle wouldn't budge. My panic surged, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel them, like an invisible presence, standing just out of sight, waiting. I turned back toward the hallway. The lights above flickered once, then died, plunging me into total darkness. My eyes widened in terror, my pulse quickening as the heavy silence surrounded me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I felt the weight of something behind me, just beyond my reach, its presence pressing in, suffocating me. Click. The sound was louder now. Closer. It was coming from the end of the hallway, where I knew the stairwell led to nowhere. I turned. A shadow stood at the far end, too large, too dark, too My legs trembled beneath me, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I didn't know what it was. I didn't care. I ran. I turned and bolted toward the fire exit, slamming my shoulder into the door, the metal protesting under the weight of my desperation. It opened just enough for me to squeeze through. I burst out into the night air, gasping, breathing in the cool, damp air of the alleyway. I didn't stop running. My feet pounded against the pavement, the sound of my footsteps filling my ears, drowning out everything else. My breath was ragged, my chest aching, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. The streetlights flickered as I ran, casting fleeting shadows on the pavement. The city was quiet, unnervingly so. The hum of traffic, the bustle of people, the life of the city was gone. It felt abandoned, like a place that had been forgotten by time. And then, there it was again, the whisper. Soft. Chilling. Adam. I stopped dead in my tracks. My blood ran cold, and I slowly turned around, but I couldn't see anything. Nothing. The street was empty, the buildings silent, their windows dark and lifeless. But I could feel it. The presence was there, closer than ever. Watching. Waiting. It was as if the very air had turned against me, thick and suffocating. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. The world around me felt like it was bending, shifting, pulling me into some dark void where nothing could escape. My body felt heavy, as though gravity itself was trying to crush me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, desperate for an explanation, a way out. I couldn't breathe. The air was oppressive, suffocating. And then I heard it. A single footstep. Click. It echoed from behind me, sharp and sudden, like a snap. I turned, slowly this time, and saw it. A figure. Tall. Shadowed. Its features obscured, but its presence undeniable. The darkness seemed to pull around it, twisting and writhing as if alive. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in the deep shadow. It stepped closer, slow and deliberate. Adam, it whispered again. We've been waiting. The world around me began to crumble, the street fading, the air thickening until it was suffocating. The figure moved closer, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. It was all too much. And then, in the depths of the darkness, I realized the truth. I was never meant to escape. I had been a part of this from the very beginning. The phone call, the footsteps, the whispers, all of it had led to this moment. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I tried to flee, there was no escaping what was coming. The shadows closed in around me, and I understood then that the end was not a choice, it was inevitable. Have you ever stopped to pick up a stranger on the road? Have you ever wondered who they really are, or what their story might be? That night, I found myself asking those very questions as I slowed my car to a stop along the side of a desolate highway. The evening sky was bruised with dark clouds, and the air smelled of rain, but there was no storm yet. Just the occasional flash of distant lightning illuminating the stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. I had been driving for hours, my thoughts a jumble of worries and work, when I saw her standing by the roadside. At first, she appeared as nothing more than a figure in the distance, barely visible in the dim light of my headlights. But as I got closer, I saw her more clearly, a woman, alone, dressed in a simple coat, her face obscured by the shadows. She didn't wave or signal, just stood there, still as a statue. For a moment, I hesitated. I had always been taught not to pick up hitchhikers. The stories you hear, the warnings, people with bad intentions, dangerous situations. But something about her made me pause. It wasn't fear, it was something else. Curiosity. A need to help, maybe. I pulled over, my tires scraping softly against the gravel as I came to a stop. I rolled down the window, my hand hovering over the door handle. The woman didn't speak, didn't move. She simply turned her head towards me, her eyes reflecting the faint light from the car. Need a ride? I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet of the night. For a moment, there was no response. She stood there, motionless. I was about to roll up the window and drive off when she finally spoke. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and calm. There was something about it, something distant, detached. It didn't sound like the voice of someone who had been waiting out in the cold for help. I opened the door and she climbed in without a word, settling into the passenger seat. As she did, I noticed the faint smell of something floral on her coat, almost like perfume, but also old. Faded. She didn't smell like someone who had been out in the rain. She smelled like someone who had been gone for a long time. I started the car and began to drive, the road stretching out before us, the steady hum of the engine filling the silence between us. I glanced over at her occasionally, but she didn't seem to notice. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window, though I wasn't sure if she was actually looking at anything. The landscape outside was as barren as the inside of the car. Just endless stretches of dark highway. The silence between us was palpable, but I didn't mind it. There was something calming about her presence, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone in this quiet stretch of road. But there was also something strange about her. She never looked at me. Never spoke again. Her stillness was almost unnerving, but I didn't say anything. Maybe she was tired, maybe she just wanted to be alone in her thoughts. We drove in silence for what felt like miles. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel her presence next to me, as if she were a shadow in the seat beside me. Every now and then, the headlights of oncoming cars would briefly illuminate her face, and I would catch a glimpse of her features, sharp, but not unkind. Her expression was unreadable. After some time, I began to feel uneasy. The silence, once comfortable, had started to weigh on me. I needed something, anything, to break the stillness. I cleared my throat and spoke. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She didn't answer immediately. I glanced over, but she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the dark horizon. A moment passed, and then she spoke softly. "Not far," she said. "Just far enough." Her answer, cryptic and vague, sent a chill down my spine. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as nothing more than a strange turn of phrase. But as we continued down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We drove for what seemed like hours. The minutes stretched into an uncomfortable eternity, and still, she didn't speak. I kept looking at her out of the corner of my eye, wondering if I should say something. But every time I opened my mouth, I felt a growing sense of dread. The air between us thickened with an invisible weight, and I couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just a simple ride. And then, just as the first drops of rain began to tap lightly against the windshield, she spoke again. "Stop here," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was a certain finality to it. I glanced around, surprised to see that we were on the edge of a small, unlit pull-off on the side of the highway. There was nothing here but darkness and the occasional flicker of distant lights from passing cars. I slowed the car to a stop, the tires skidding lightly on the wet road. She didn't move at first, just sat there in her seat, her eyes fixed forward. I waited for her to say something else, but she didn't. "Are you sure this is where you want to get off?" I asked, trying to make sense of the situation. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out something, holding it out to me. It was a photograph. Confused, I took it from her hand. As I looked down at the image, my stomach dropped. It was a photograph of my family, my wife, my daughter, and me standing in front of our house, smiling as though we were posing for a family portrait. But the thing was, I had never seen this photo before in my life. I looked up at her, my heart racing. But she was already opening the door, stepping out into the rain without a word. "Wait!" I shouted, but she didn't stop. She just walked away, fading into the darkness, leaving me with the photograph in my hand, a photograph that shouldn't have existed. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I sat there in the car, the rain beginning to pour, staring at the photograph in my hands. My mind raced, the questions piling up. How could she know about my family? How could she have that photo? But before I could make sense of it, I heard something soft, distant, almost like a whisper in the wind. A voice, faint and far away, saying just one word. "Goodbye." I turned, but there was nothing. No one. Only the rain. I sat there in the car, the rain pouring steadily now, a constant rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of my heart. The photograph in my hand felt heavier than it should. My fingers trembled as I held it, my mind trying desperately to piece together something that made sense, but nothing did. How could she have known? How could she have seen that picture? I hadn't even shown it to anyone, not in years. The windshield wipers swept in a steady motion, clearing the rain for a brief moment, but then the darkened road ahead returned in blurry swirls. I should have driven off, should have left that strange encounter behind, but I couldn't. Something gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake, a feeling of dread that crawled beneath my skin. I stared at the photograph again, trying to find some explanation. It was a picture of my wife, my daughter, and me standing on the porch of our house. A perfect day, bright and sunny. But then I remembered something. The picture was old, taken years ago. It was a memory from a time I hadn't thought about in a long while. It had been taken before the accident, before my daughter died. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my mind, trying to push the thoughts away. But it was no use. That photo had been taken years ago, before the tragedy. After the crash, the picture had been tucked away, stored in a box of forgotten memories. The memory of my daughter, gone before her time, still haunted me. How could this woman have had that photograph? It was impossible. I couldn't sit there anymore. My hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel, and I started the car, the engine roaring to life. The rain hammered against the roof as I pulled back onto the highway, my eyes scanning the darkness ahead, but there was no sign of the woman. No trace of her. The emptiness of the road was suffocating. As I drove, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, watching me, or maybe to catch a glimpse of a figure in the headlights. But nothing. The road stretched behind me, empty and silent. Still, the nagging feeling remained. I glanced at the photograph in my lap again. A creeping unease crawled over me. The night was far from over, and the silence in the car, still oppressive, made my thoughts feel like they were spinning in endless circles. Each minute felt longer than the last. Eventually, I pulled into a small rest area to collect myself. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows over the otherwise quiet lot. I parked the car, but I didn't get out immediately. I just sat there, gripping the photograph in my hand, my mind racing. How had she known about the picture? More importantly, how had she known about my daughter? I wasn't ready to face the truth, not yet, but I couldn't ignore it either. This wasn't just a random encounter. This had to mean something. I thought back to what she said when she climbed into my car, not far. Just far enough. The words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't grasp their meaning. Suddenly, I froze. The rain had stopped. It was as if the world itself had held its breath, and the unnatural stillness settled over the rest area like a heavy fog. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was already past midnight. But the silence felt like it had stretched much longer. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, so soft I almost thought it was my imagination. But no! It was real. A tapping. Light, rhythmic, against the passenger side window. I slowly turned my head, my heartbeat quickening. The window was fogged from the humidity, but through the mist, I saw a reflection. The woman. Standing there, just outside the car, staring at me with those eyes that seemed so distant, so knowing. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared, the same vacant expression on her face. Her hands hung loosely at her sides. My throat tightened. I knew I should have driven away, but I couldn't. Something held me there, as if my body refused to obey the simple instinct to escape. I rolled down the window, just a crack, and her voice, soft as before, drifted inside. "Did you look closely?" she asked. I felt a shiver run through me. "What?" "Look at the photo again," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You'll see it." I blinked, confusion swirling in my head. Was she talking about the photo I still held in my hands? The one she had given me earlier? Without a word, I lifted the photograph, my hand shaking as I gazed down at it once more. It looked the same as it had before, but something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my heart began to race. I stared harder. Then I saw it. In the background, behind my wife and daughter, there was something, or someone, standing in the shadows of the porch. Someone I didn't recognize. A figure, half obscured, but still undeniably there. I had never seen this person before. But there they were, standing just beyond my family, a ghostly silhouette in the photo. I looked up from the photograph to the woman outside the car. She was gone. Just like that, she had disappeared into the night. I was alone. My breath caught in my throat, and I suddenly realized just how much I had overlooked. There had been more to that photo than I could understand, more than I had been willing to acknowledge. The mysterious woman had known far more than she had let on. I slammed the car into gear and sped off into the night. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That someone was always watching. And no matter how many times I looked at that photo, I couldn't unsee the figure in the background. The figure who shouldn't have been there. The figure who had been waiting for me all along. The miles blurred past in a haze of headlights and rain-slick pavement. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. The road was endless, and it felt like I was driving to outrun something I couldn't escape. Every time I glanced at the photograph, that figure in the background seemed to shift, to move closer to the foreground, as if the more I focused on it, the more real it became. It wasn't just an image, it was a presence, a shadow that grew with each passing second. I pulled off the highway again, this time into a small, sleepy town. The neon sign of a diner flickered in the distance, its soft light barely cutting through the darkness. I parked in front of the diner and sat there for a moment, staring at the rain streaking down my windshield, feeling the weight of my thoughts pressing on me. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. The way she had appeared out of nowhere, the eerie silence between us, the way she had known about my family, about my daughter. And the photograph. It felt like some kind of puzzle or riddle I couldn't solve. I opened the door and stepped out into the wet, cool air. The sound of the rain hitting the pavement was loud in the quiet, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the faint scent of gasoline. I needed to clear my head. I needed answers. Inside, the diner was warm, with the low hum of a jukebox playing in the background. A few patrons sat at the counter, but no one seemed to pay me any attention as I walked in. The waitress, an older woman with graying hair, gave me a quick glance before returning to wiping down the counter. "Coffee?" she asked in a tired voice. I nodded and took a seat by the window. As I sat there, waiting, I noticed something strange, a feeling that I wasn't quite alone, even though the diner was mostly empty. The reflection in the window seemed to shift, like there was someone behind me, but when I turned around, the room was empty. It was the same unsettling sensation I'd felt earlier with the woman, that sense of being watched. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting the cup down in front of me with a soft clink. "You all right, hon?" she asked, her eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." She gave a slow, understanding nod. "A lot of people pass through here, and sometimes the road does things to you," she said quietly, as if she were talking to herself more than to me. "It plays tricks on your mind, makes you see things that aren't there." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't respond. Instead, I just stared at the coffee in front of me, the steam rising in a spiral. My fingers tightened around the photograph in my pocket, feeling its edges dig into my skin. I couldn't let go of it. It was like the only thing that kept me tethered to reality, even though it was anything but real. The waitress walked away, and I took a sip of the coffee, the bitter warmth doing little to calm the turmoil inside me. I could feel the tension building, tightening around my chest with every passing second. There was something wrong. Something deeper than the woman, than the photograph. I could feel it creeping in, a dark presence I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the bell above the diner door jingled, and a cold gust of wind swept in. I looked up, and my heart stopped. Standing in the doorway, looking out of place in the quiet, empty diner, was a man. He was tall, his coat dark and heavy against the cold. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I could see the outline of his figure, angular, tense, as if he was waiting for something. The man's eyes swept over the room, then landed on me. For a moment, I thought I saw recognition in his gaze, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He turned and sat down at the far end of the counter, never once looking back at me. I felt a strange pull toward him, as if something about him was connected to everything that had been happening. But why? I had no idea. I finished my coffee in one swift gulp, the bitterness lingering in the back of my throat. My fingers were shaking as I wiped my mouth, but I didn't feel like I could sit here any longer. The need to leave was overwhelming. I stood up and walked toward the door, my legs heavy, as if the weight of the atmosphere in the diner had been pressing on me. As I stepped outside, I felt the cold air rush in, but it wasn't the cold that made me shiver, it was the sensation of being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I kept walking toward my car, my heart racing. The man hadn't moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something important, something that tied all of this together. My mind was a storm of confusion, fear, and questions, but I needed answers. I was halfway to my car when I heard it, a voice, faint and muffled, carried by the wind. It was soft, but unmistakable. "Look again." My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, my eyes scanning the diner's window. Through the mist on the glass, I saw the reflection of the man standing just behind me. But he wasn't alone. In the reflection, I saw the woman, the one who had appeared on the side of the road. She was standing beside him, her pale face turned towards me. And in her hands, she held the photograph. My photograph. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the reflection shifted, warping like smoke in the glass. I blinked, and they were gone. I didn't wait. I turned and ran to my car, my hands fumbling as I tried to unlock the door. The keys slipped from my fingers, but I grabbed them and finally got the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, locking the doors as I threw the car into drive. I didn't look back. But as I sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The eyes of the woman and the man seemed to follow me, lingering just out of sight. And the photograph. It was still in my pocket. And it was still changing. The engine roared to life, and the headlights sliced through the night as I pushed the pedal to the floor. The road ahead blurred, twisting and turning, but no matter how fast I drove, the feeling that I wasn't alone clung to me like a second skin. I checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see their faces, those cold, distant expressions watching me from the shadows. I couldn't focus on the road anymore. My mind was racing, spinning with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't control. The photograph. The woman. The man. The feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter, but something much darker, something fate had decided for me. I glanced at the photograph again, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it from my jacket pocket. The familiar faces of my wife and daughter smiled up at me, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The figure in the background, the one I hadn't noticed before, seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing with life of its own. My hand shook as I stared at it. It was impossible. It couldn't be. But there it was. In the shadowed corner of the porch, a figure. Tall, indistinct, but its eyes were watching me now. I had no doubt. There was no denying it anymore. It wasn't just a memory captured in a photo. That figure, whoever or whatever it was real. I couldn't escape the mounting pressure in my chest, the dread that twisted my gut. Something in that moment told me I was past the point of no return. Whatever had started with that woman at the side of the road, it was leading me somewhere I didn't understand. The road stretched endlessly before me, but I wasn't getting any closer to safety. The darkness outside felt like it was closing in, suffocating me. I pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, my heart racing. My eyes scanned the surroundings, trees on either side, the occasional distant house hidden behind the thick fog. No signs of life. No movement. Yet, I knew I wasn't alone. I jumped out of the car, my feet hitting the wet pavement with a thud. I stood there for a moment, just breathing in the thick air, trying to calm my spiraling mind. The wind had picked up, and the trees around me creaked as though groaning under some unseen weight. It was then that I heard it. A soft rustle, like footsteps moving through the underbrush, distant but unmistakable. I whipped around. Nothing. I turned back to the car, but it was the reflection in the side mirror that made my stomach drop. The man, his figure was outlined by the headlights, but he wasn't standing at the diner. He was here, with me, staring at my car, just out of reach. His dark coat billowed around him, and his face was still hidden beneath the hood, but I knew, somehow, that he was aware of me. He had been watching me all along. I was caught. There was no escape now. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, the woman's voice echoed through the air. "Look at what you've become." I froze. The words were soft, but they cut through the silence like a knife. My head snapped to the side, searching for her, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of the highway. But then I saw it, just beyond the glow of my headlights, barely visible in the darkness, her figure, standing by the trees. Her eyes gleamed with something ancient, something far older than human. She didn't move, but I could feel her gaze, cold and calculating, like it was pulling me in, drawing me closer to some fate I couldn't understand. I could barely breathe. My vision blurred, my head spinning with dizziness. I staggered back toward the car, desperate to escape whatever was happening. But as my hand reached for the door handle, the wind shifted and the smell hit me. It was the smell of decay. Of something long forgotten, something that had been buried for too long. It was overwhelming, suffocating. I whipped around again, my heart pounding, my body trembling with fear. The woman was gone, but the man was standing closer now, much closer, only a few feet away. His eyes were still hidden beneath the hood, but there was no mistaking the intent in his presence. His stillness, the way he stood there, as if he had all the time in the world, was unsettling. It was as though he had been waiting for me. Waiting for this exact moment. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't make myself leave. I had to know. I had to understand. I stumbled forward, the cold air biting at my skin, and I found myself standing before the man. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. His head tilted slightly, as if considering the question, but he didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand. And it was the photograph. The same photograph. My heart stopped. It was no longer just my family in the photo. The figure, the one that had been in the shadows, was now standing directly in front of my daughter and wife. It was the man, the one who had been following me. But something was different now, something terrifying. His eyes, they were staring at me. Right at me. I staggered backward, my body shaking violently. The photograph slipped from his hand, floating gently to the ground, and I saw it. The figure in the photo was now looking directly at me, its features indistinct but familiar. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, icy, unyielding. I turned around, but there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. I collapsed to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The photograph was still lying in front of me, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I couldn't move. My mind, my body, everything had frozen in place. I realized then that the past, the memory of my family, wasn't just something I was trying to outrun. It wasn't something I could escape. It was here with me. And it would never let me go. The world felt like it was closing in on me, like I was trapped inside a nightmare that had no end. The man, the shadow, stood there, watching me from the edge of the trees, his presence suffocating, unblinking. He wasn't just following me anymore, he was me, a reflection of something I couldn't escape, a twisted mirror that I couldn't shatter. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, heavy, unresponsive. My mind screamed for me to move, to run, to leave this place, but I couldn't. I couldn't escape this moment, this fate that had been written for me the moment I picked up that photograph. It wasn't just a road that was endless now, it was everything. The way the darkness stretched beyond the horizon, swallowing everything in its path. The way the rain came down in sheets, relentless and cold. The way the air had thickened, heavy with the weight of something ancient, something that had been watching, waiting for me to find it. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, frantic, desperate, as though it too wanted to break free. But I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't outrun them. I turned my gaze back to the man. His face remained hidden, but I knew. I knew it was him, the same figure from the photograph, the same figure that had been standing behind me, in my house, in the corner of every shadow. And now, it was too late to turn back. Too late to wake up from the dream. You wanted to know, the man's voice was low, distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Now you see. I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. He took a step closer, the ground beneath him shifting, as though the very earth was bending to his will. The air seemed to grow colder, more suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches scraping against the sky, groaning like they were alive. I glanced at the photograph, still lying on the wet ground in front of me. The faces of my wife and daughter were no longer smiling. The figure was no longer hidden in the background. It was in the foreground now, its face twisting into something unrecognizable, something wrong, its features melting into a grotesque mockery of the people I had once known. I recoiled, my stomach lurching, and then it hit me, the realization. It wasn't just that the photograph had changed. It was that I had changed. My mind had bent under the weight of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. I wasn't the same man who had pulled over to help that woman on the side of the road. I wasn't the same man who had driven down this road, unaware of the truth. I had become a part of it. I felt a sudden rush of fear, an overwhelming sense of losing control. But then, the fear shifted. It wasn't fear of the man anymore. It wasn't fear of the woman, or the photograph, or the road. It was something deeper, something more terrifying. It was the realization that I had never been in control of any of this. I had never had a choice. The road had led me here for a reason, and I had followed it without question. The figure in the photograph, the man who had been stalking me, he was me. A twisted reflection of the man I had become. The woman, the passenger, the watcher, I realized now they were all parts of me, pieces of something I had buried in my past, buried in the corners of my own mind. I was never going to escape. The air crackled with tension as the man stepped closer, his presence enveloping me like a shadow. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs were frozen in place, my chest tight with the suffocating weight of inevitability. "You can't outrun it," the man said again, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "You never could." And then, just as quickly as he had come, he was gone. I stood there in the rain-soaked darkness, alone, but not really. The echoes of his words hung in the air, vibrating with truth. The wind howled through the trees, and the sound of the rain became a deafening roar in my ears. The photograph was still lying there on the ground. I stared at it, my eyes locked on the image, the figure in the corner. And I saw it. The man, the one I had been running from, the one I had become, was standing in the background. His face was now clear, his features twisted with malice. But more than that, I saw myself in his eyes. It was me. I had always been there. I took a step forward, the mud slipping beneath my feet, my heart pounding with the realization of what I had become. The photograph was no longer just a picture of my family. It was a record, a map of my life, of my fate. And as I reached down to pick it up, I understood. I had never been in control. The road, the woman, the photograph, they had all been leading me here. To this moment. To this realization. There was no way out. The last thing I saw before I lost myself completely was the reflection in the glass of my car's side mirror, the figure, standing in the darkness, watching me. His eyes glowed faintly, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw a smile. Then everything went dark. The road, the rain, the photograph, everything faded away, and I was left alone in the void. But even in the silence, I could still hear the whisper. You are never alone. And I knew, deep down, that it was true. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Not in the usual way, but in the way that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise, the way that makes you question whether your mind is playing tricks on you. It was exactly the kind of feeling that started one cold, uneventful evening. I never expected that something as simple as renting a room would lead me to question everything I thought I knew about reality. I had been living in that old house for a few weeks. It was the kind of place that seemed almost forgotten by time. The walls creaked and groaned with every shift of the wind, and the floorboards beneath my feet felt like they could break at any moment. Still, the rent was cheap, and for someone like me, a temporary home was enough. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Stevenson, was quiet and reclusive. I rarely saw him outside of the brief moments when I handed him the rent money, and he would offer me a polite nod before disappearing into the depths of the house. The room itself was small and bare. A single bed, an old wooden desk, and a single window that let in little light. But it was mine, and that was all that mattered. Or so I thought. It was one of those nights, the kind where the wind howled outside and the sound of rain tapping against the window made everything feel cold and distant. I had just finished a long day at work, exhausted from the monotonous routine, and was looking forward to a quiet evening in my room. I unlocked the door with the familiar sound of the key turning in the lock, but something felt off as I pushed the door open. The door was ajar. I stood frozen for a moment, key still in hand, staring at the gap in the door. I had locked it when I left that morning, hadn't I? I always did. I always made sure the key was in my pocket. The thought of someone being in my room while I was away sent a chill down my spine. But when I cautiously pushed the door open further, I found the room just as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at me from the inside. I checked the door again, making sure it was locked when I left earlier. I was sure I had. But there it was, open, as if someone had been there just moments before I returned. I took a step inside, setting my bag down on the floor. The dim light from the hallway spilled across the floor, casting long shadows in the corners of the room. It was the kind of place where shadows had a way of making you feel like they were moving, like they were more than just darkness. I walked to my desk, pulled out a chair, and sat down. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened my bag and pulled out my phone. I needed a moment to settle, to think. I scrolled through my messages absent-mindedly, trying to distract myself, but my mind kept going back to the door. Had someone been in here? The silence in the room was heavy, but it didn't feel like the usual quiet of an empty house. It was thick, oppressive, as though the walls were pressing in on me. I looked around the room again, my gaze flicking to the small window. The street lights outside were blurred by the rain, and the only sound that reached me was the soft hiss of water against the glass. Then, I heard it. A soft creak from the hallway. I jumped, my heart racing. I was sure I'd locked the door. Was someone else here? I stood up, my mind a mess of confusion and paranoia. I walked cautiously toward the door, my feet barely making a sound on the worn floorboards. I reached for the handle, but just before I touched it, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. I froze. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside my door. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. The minutes dragged on. Whoever it was didn't knock. They didn't even call out to me. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I couldn't help but feel as though someone was just waiting, watching. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. 3 quick raps that echoed in the stillness of the house. I jerked back, startled by the sound. Slowly, I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there. I stood in the doorway, looking both ways down the hallway, my mind racing. There was nothing, only the soft hum of the house settling, the occasional groan of the floorboards above. My breath came out in shallow gasps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Someone had been there. I closed the door quickly and locked it behind me. It felt like I had just narrowly escaped something, like something had been there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. But the strangest part? No one in the house seemed to have heard the knock. Mr. Stevenson was still nowhere to be found, and none of the other tenants mentioned anything out of the ordinary. But as I sat back down on my bed, trying to calm my nerves, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The key was still in my pocket, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my room. Someone who had no business being there. And that was only the beginning. The days that followed felt strange, as though I were walking through a dream. Everything appeared normal at first glance, my routine, my work, the moments I spent in my rented room. But underneath it all, there was a gnawing sensation that I couldn't ignore. The feeling that something was wrong, something beyond just an unlocked door, had settled deep in my chest. I tried to dismiss the events of the previous night as some trick of my mind, a moment of fatigue or paranoia. But as I walked through the house each day, the silence weighed heavier on me. The walls felt thinner, the shadows deeper. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, every breeze that swept through the cracks in the windows felt like a whisper just out of reach. It was a few days later when I encountered my first unsettling interaction with the neighbors. I was leaving the house early one morning to head to work when I saw Mrs. Brown, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from my room. She was standing in the hallway, leaning heavily on her cane, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Good morning, dear," she said, her voice raspy but warm. "You're off to work again, I suppose?" I nodded politely, too tired to engage in much conversation. But she seemed determined to talk. "You know," she continued, "I saw you yesterday. You were coming out of the house, but I thought you were already at work. Funny thing, isn't it? I stopped in my tracks, suddenly aware that she was speaking with an odd sense of knowing. What do you mean? I asked, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. She smiled faintly, but there was something cold in her expression. Oh, I saw you leave the house, and then I saw you again not long after. You were walking down the street, looking just like you do now. Same jacket, same hair. Funny how time works, isn't it? A chill ran through me. I knew I hadn't left my room after I had left for work that morning. I had gone straight to the office, and there was no way I could have come back to the house during the day without noticing. Maybe you were mistaken, I offered, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, no, she said, shaking her head slowly. I know what I saw. You looked just like you. In the hallway here, just the other day. I gave her a weak smile, excused myself, and hurried past her. My mind raced with confusion. Had I missed something? Was there some way I could have forgotten coming back home during the day? I had been at work all day. But if Mrs. Brown was to be believed, she had seen me walking down the street. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was losing control of my own perceptions. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my work, but thoughts of what Mrs. Brown had said kept intruding. That night, I returned to my room, but the familiar weight of unease had followed me. When I unlocked the door to my room and stepped inside, I didn't even feel the need to check if the door had been left open again. The feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. I turned on the lights and froze. The desk, which I had left neatly arranged earlier that day, was now a mess. Papers were scattered across the surface, the chair pushed back as though someone had been sitting there. The window, which I had left closed, was slightly ajar, the faintest draft making the curtains flutter. I didn't know what to think. Was I imagining things? Was someone coming into my room without my knowledge? The more I thought about it, the more my thoughts spiraled. I couldn't be sure, but something inside me told me this wasn't just a simple mistake. I hadn't left the window open. I hadn't left my desk like that. And yet, there was no one here. I was alone. It was then that I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart raced. Who could it be? I hesitated before walking over to the door, my mind already racing through 1,000 possibilities. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. Hello? I said quietly, before opening the door slightly. There was no one there. Confused and growing increasingly anxious, I stepped out into the hallway. The lights flickered above me, casting strange, fleeting shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should. I peered down both ends of the corridor, but there was no sign of anyone. I closed the door quickly behind me, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. This wasn't just coincidence. Something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. But the feeling, the overwhelming sense that something was watching me, was undeniable. Then, in the silence of the hallway, I heard it. A soft voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. You're not alone. I spun around, my mind racing, but once again, the hallway was empty. The whisper, though, echoed in my ears, and with it, the horrifying realization I had never been alone. Not really. There was someone, or something, here with me, and it was getting closer. I had no idea how I was supposed to survive this. How do you fight something you can't even see? It didn't take long for the fear to settle in completely. The house, once just an inconvenient temporary place to stay, had begun to feel like a prison. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the truth was undeniable. Something was very wrong. The days blurred into one another, but each night brought more unsettling signs. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even while I locked myself in my room. The shadowy corners seemed darker, the sounds of the house louder and more menacing. Every creak of the floorboards felt like footsteps following me. The neighbors' odd behavior continued. Mrs. Brown's cryptic comments grew more frequent, and other tenants, people I had never spoken to before, would occasionally mention seeing me when I was sure I wasn't around. They would smile, nod, and say things like, "I saw you leaving this morning," or "I didn't expect you to be back so early." It was unnerving. I began to feel like I was living in someone else's life, as though my actions were being mirrored by an unseen version of myself. A version of me that moved and spoke just like me, but wasn't me. It was as if I were losing control of my own existence. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I returned to the house, hoping to put the strange occurrences out of my mind. The rain had started up again, and the air felt thick with unease as I approached the front door. As I fumbled for my keys, the door swung open before I even touched the handle. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped inside, cautiously, and noticed that something was different. It wasn't just the open door, it was everything. The air was colder than usual, the room felt strangely empty, as though someone, or something, had just left. I quickly glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing gently in the wind. But it was more than that. On my desk, there was a small object I didn't recognize. It was a key. I stared at it for a long moment, my breath catching in my throat. It was old-fashioned, the kind you'd find in an antique shop, a heavy, iron key with intricate designs on the handle. It looked completely out of place in my room, but there it was, lying innocently on my desk, as though it had always been there. My mind raced. How could it be here? I hadn't brought it, and none of the neighbors had mentioned anything about it. The key didn't belong to me. But, somehow, it felt familiar. Almost like I had seen it before. I picked it up hesitantly, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingers. The strange markings on the handle seemed to twist and shift under the dim light. As I examined it more closely, I felt a sudden compulsion to look at the back of my door. The key's purpose seemed clear now. I walked slowly to the door, key in hand, and inspected the lock. Sure enough, there was a second lock I hadn't noticed before. The kind that was used for an additional security measure. It was old, rusted, and entirely out of place on a door that seemed to have been used so often by the landlord. I had never seen it before, and yet it seemed right. Like it had always been there, like it was part of the door. I hesitated before sliding the key into the lock. The moment it turned, I felt a strange, almost electric jolt run through me. The door clicked open, and with a sharp breath, I pushed it in. I expected a dark, dusty closet, perhaps a storage space for old furniture or forgotten belongings. But what I found was much worse. It was another room, and it was identical to my own. The same desk, the same bed, the same window. The walls were a faded, peeling shade of yellow, and the furniture was old and worn, just like my room. But everything in this second room felt wrong. There was a thick layer of dust everywhere, as though it hadn't been used in years. Yet, the room appeared perfectly arranged, as though someone had carefully placed everything just so. I stepped inside, the creaking floorboards echoing in the eerie silence. I felt the air grow heavier, and a strange, oppressive feeling began to fill the space. My throat tightened as I scanned the room, my mind racing. This wasn't just a room that looked like mine. It was my room. It mirrored everything about my own, down to the smallest detail. The desk, exactly the same, but with papers scattered across it. The window, exactly the same, but the curtains were drawn tight, blocking the light. The bed, exactly the same, but the covers were disheveled, as though someone had been lying there recently. It didn't make sense. How could this be here? And why was it locked away, hidden behind a door I had never seen before? My breath quickened as I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the room for any signs of life. The air felt stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in ages, but I could still feel the lingering presence of something or someone there. I turned back to the door, but before I could step out, I froze. On the bed, there was something. A photograph. I walked over slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I picked it up, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The photo was of a family, of me, my parents, and my younger brother. But there was something wrong. I didn't recognize the picture. It was a family photo that I had never seen before, one where I was much younger. And yet, it was me, my face, my eyes, my expression. But I didn't remember ever taking this photo. And what's worse, it wasn't a photo I had ever seen. I felt my pulse race as I realized what was happening. This room, this hidden, locked space, had been watching me. It had been waiting for me to find it. And now, the key was in my hand. It was clear, whatever had been in this room had been there long before I arrived. And it was waiting for me. The photo still gripped my hand, the edges cold and jagged as I stared at the unfamiliar faces. My family, but a version of them I couldn't recognize. The background was unclear, like a blur of some place I had never been. The photos seemed so off, as though someone had manipulated it to appear like my past, but it was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. I had never been in this room. But here it was, this room that mirrored mine in every possible way. And now this photograph. I wanted to run, to bolt out of that room, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. My body trembled as the weight of what was happening settled in, and a cold wave of dread crept up my spine. I had no idea what this place was, why it was here, or why it had me in its grip. But one thing was certain, the strange feeling of being watched, of being followed, had grown sharper, more real. I stuffed the photograph into my pocket, feeling its rough edges through the fabric. I couldn't leave it there. It was too much of a clue. Too much of a message. I stepped back toward the door, but just as I reached for the handle, the air in the room seemed to shift. It became heavier, suffocating. I could feel something, or someone, moving in the space around me, unseen but felt. It was like being in a room with a presence that you couldn't see but knew was there. Suddenly, a sound cut through the thick silence. A sharp knock. Then another. My heart skipped. Someone was knocking at the door. But there was no one here, no one else in the house. The knock wasn't coming from the outside, it was coming from within the room. From the other side of the wall. The room began to pulse with an unnatural energy. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I turned in a circle, eyes darting from corner to corner. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as though something was taking form in the dark spaces, something that was not human. The knock echoed again. Louder. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I felt the air around me press in, constricting my chest. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, but the sound of that knock, that relentless pounding, continued to echo in my mind. I rushed down the hall, desperate to get back to my room, to lock the door, to shut out whatever was happening. But when I reached my door, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was wide open. I stood there, staring at the empty hallway, my pulse racing. I had locked it earlier that evening. I was sure of it. But now it was open, no one was inside, but the room felt wrong again, as though someone had been here. I crept inside, cautious, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. Nothing except a quiet hum of electricity in the air, a feeling that something was about to break the silence. The bed was untouched, the desk still clean and orderly. But on the floor, something caught my eye. A scrap of paper, small and crumpled, as though someone had discarded it in a hurry. I reached down and picked it up, unfolding it carefully. My hands trembled as I read the words written in black ink. "You're not alone in this house. Neither are they." I felt a wave of nausea hit me, my stomach turning as the words burned into my mind. What did it mean? Who was they? And how did they know what was happening to me? I rushed to the window, pushing the curtains aside and staring out into the night. The darkness beyond the glass stretched endlessly, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. There was nothing, no sign of anyone. But the air felt suffocating, and the heavy weight of something lingering in the house made my breath catch in my throat. A shadow darted past the window. I gasped, heart leaping into my throat. But when I looked back, the street was still empty. The knocking, the photo, the second room, it was all connected. I had walked into something that didn't belong to me, and now it was following me, closing in. Something was living here, something that wasn't me, something that had been here before. I turned back to the room, the crumpled note still in my hand. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. But as I stepped toward the door, the light flickered, and the temperature dropped suddenly. The air grew cold, like the night outside had crept in. A soft whisper, almost inaudible, floated to my ears. "Come back." I froze. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was a whisper of my own voice, my own words. But I hadn't spoken. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, locking with a metallic click. Panic surged through me as I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. And then I heard it again. A soft knock, not from the door, but from inside. The knocking began again, coming from the wall, the floorboards, the ceiling. It was as if something was tapping its way through the house, getting closer with every second. I was trapped. And worse, I had no idea what waited for me in the other room, behind that hidden door. I felt the cold sweat run down my back as I backed away from the door, hearing the faint echoes of footsteps moving through the house. Footsteps that weren't mine. Footsteps that were coming closer. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, each step echoing in the suffocating silence. The house felt alive, the walls pressing in on me as I turned to face the room once more. The knocking grew louder, frantic, relentless, as though the walls themselves were alive, reaching out to me. I could feel it in my bones, in my skin, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of being hunted. I pressed my back against the cold, splintering wood of the door, the shadows in the room swirling like ink bleeding into water. The footsteps, slow and measured, grew clearer with each passing second. They weren't mine. They weren't human. The air around me hummed with an energy that had no name, and I realized with a sickening jolt that whatever was in this house with me, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. A sudden thought struck me. The hallway. The hallway behind me. It stretched out in an endless, claustrophobic corridor where the light flickered overhead, casting long, twisting shadows. The hallway felt alive in the same way the room did, filled with something dark, something ancient. I needed to leave. I had to find the exit, but I knew that no matter where I went, I wouldn't escape. With trembling hands, I reached for the door again, my fingers brushing the cold handle. But then I froze. A soft sound, like breathing, came from the other side. It was shallow, rapid, and unmistakably human. I wasn't alone. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to listen. The breathing quickened, becoming more frantic, but I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I needed to get out. But where could I go? The house felt like a labyrinth, and every room I opened led me deeper into its grip. The footsteps, no, the things, were closer now. They were moving swiftly, and the tapping that had once been a slow rhythm now sounded like frantic scratching, clawing at the very foundation of the house. I could hear whispers, too. Faint, distorted, unintelligible, as though they were coming from every corner at once. "Help me," a voice whispered, the sound too close, too real. It wasn't my voice, but it sounded like something familiar. The door rattled violently, making me jump. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I yanked the door open, my pulse roaring in my ears. The hallway was empty, its wooden floor creaking under my weight as I stepped into the darkness. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like fingers reaching for me. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw next. The door at the end of the hallway was wide open. My door. The same door I had just exited. It was impossible. I had just been inside, locked in, but now it was wide open, as if it had always been that way. I stared at the door, my mind trying to make sense of it. This couldn't be happening. My own footsteps echoed back at me, a reminder of how small and alone I felt. My head spun with confusion as I stumbled toward the open door. But just as my hand reached the handle, I stopped. The room beyond the door was not my room. It was the room from the photograph. The one I had seen earlier. The same walls. The same furniture. The same family photo sitting on the nightstand. I felt a surge of panic flood through me. How was this possible? How could I be standing in two places at once? The air grew colder, the whispers louder. I stepped backward, but the hallway stretched on longer than I had remembered. My room, the real one, was nowhere to be seen. The walls closed in on me, and I could feel the darkness closing its grip. And then I saw it. In the corner of my eye, a figure. A shadow. A silhouette of a person standing at the end of the hallway. Their features were indistinct, their shape blurred, but I knew it wasn't human. It couldn't be. It stood motionless, watching me. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in quicksand. My breath came in short gasps, and the darkness pressed in tighter with each passing moment. The figure didn't move. It didn't have to. It was already here. With every step I took, the hallway grew longer. The doors multiplied, stretching out in all directions, each one leading to another version of the room, another version of me. Another photograph on the nightstand. Another me in the picture, smiling, living a life I didn't remember. The figure was closer now, its shape becoming clearer. It was a twisted reflection of myself, a version of me, but its face was distorted, as if someone had taken my image and torn it apart. Its eyes were dark, empty voids, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It stepped toward me, slowly, deliberately. And then it spoke. "You're not real," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers blending into one. "None of this is real." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body betrayed me, frozen in place. My thoughts were scrambled, like fragments of a broken puzzle, unable to make sense of the nightmare I was trapped in. I didn't know what was real anymore. The hallway, the house, the photo, the knocking, and the figure, the other me, closing in. I took one last step back, and then the door slammed shut. Have you ever received a message from someone who's been gone for years? Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you. Or maybe something else is happening. I still don't know which one it was. It started like any other evening. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to wind down after a long day. The usual noise of the world around me seemed distant in the quiet. I had been thinking about Alex a lot recently. The anniversary of his death was coming up, and with it, all the memories that had never quite faded. The night he passed still haunted me, and I couldn't stop remembering his smile, the way his voice used to sound when he'd tell me about his dreams. I had 1,000 regrets and questions that would never be answered. I unlocked my phone and opened Facebook. The familiar notifications blinked at me, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, a new message popped up. "Hey, it's been a while, hasn't it?" My fingers froze above the screen. I blinked and stared at the message, my heart stopping. The profile picture was the same one I remembered, a photo of Alex and me at a concert we had gone to years ago. He was smiling, his arm around me, carefree. But Alex had died 2 years ago. My mind raced. Could it be some kind of sick joke? Someone playing around with an old photo? But the message didn't feel like a prank. It felt real. Too real. It didn't make sense. I checked the sender's name again. It was Alex's profile, his account still active, but it couldn't be him. It had to be some kind of glitch or a scam. I opened the message. "How have you been? You look great. It's been too long since we talked. I miss you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The screen blurred as my fingers shook, and I felt a chill sweep through the room. I clicked on his profile. It was all there. Pictures of places we had visited together, old posts, our conversations. All of it. But no new activity. Alex had been gone for years. I scrolled through the messages we'd shared. They were just as I remembered, until this new one appeared, with no warning. I stared at the message again, my mind racing. My heart thudded in my chest, and my fingers were suddenly cold against the screen. The last time I'd heard from Alex, it was before the accident. Before everything ended. Before I had to say goodbye in a way I never wanted to. I typed a response, my hand shaking with hesitation. "Alex?" For a long moment, there was nothing. No reply, no sign of life. I felt my pulse quicken. Maybe it was just some weird glitch, like I had imagined. I should turn off my phone and go to sleep. but I couldn't stop myself. I kept staring at the screen, waiting for a reply. And then it came. I'm here. I'm sorry. I never got to say goodbye properly. My breath caught in my throat. I reread the message several times, hoping it would make sense, but it didn't. The words felt too familiar, too personal. This was Alex. There was no doubt in my mind. But how? How is this possible? How is this even happening? I typed back, my hands now trembling. The dots appeared. He was typing. I held my breath, waiting for his words. The dots stopped and then appeared again, as though the message was coming together in real time. I never left, not really. You just couldn't see me anymore. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. I felt a strange sensation running up my spine, a feeling that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't the only one in this room. I didn't know how to respond. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What was going on? This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. And yet, there it was, his name, his words. The weight of it crushed down on me. Please stop. I don't understand. You're dead. The words escaped before I could stop them. There was a long pause. The dots appeared, then disappeared. I held my breath. My finger hovered over the send button, but I couldn't press it. I just couldn't. I was terrified of what would come next. Finally, the response came. I never died, you know. You just think I did. The words shook me to my core. My stomach twisted into knots. There was no explanation, no comfort. Only the cold, terrifying truth of what I had just read. The weight of it was suffocating, the room around me growing darker, smaller, until I felt I could barely breathe. I looked up from my phone, my eyes darting nervously around the room. Everything was exactly where it should be. The bed, the curtains, the windows slightly cracked open, letting in a cool breeze. But something felt wrong. Something was off. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my heart pounding. I was still staring at the message, still hoping this was some kind of prank, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I knew this wasn't real in the way I understood real. The message blinked again, and the next one made my blood run cold. I'm right behind you. And in that moment, the air around me shifted. I couldn't move. My fingers froze on the screen, my breath caught in my chest. For a few moments, everything stood still. It felt like time had stopped, as though the very air in the room had thickened and trapped me in this moment. I stared at the last message over and over again, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'm right behind you. I slowly turned my head, hoping, praying that it was just a trick of my mind. Maybe I had read it wrong, or maybe it was a glitch. But as my eyes scanned the room, the weight of silence pressed down on me. Nothing had changed. The walls were the same, the window was still cracked open, letting in just enough cold air to remind me I was still awake. I tried to shake off the feeling. It's just a message, I told myself. Just a prank. But the unease gnawed at my stomach. The sensation of something being wrong didn't fade. It grew, building steadily, until it felt like something was in the room with me. Something close. I swallowed hard, willing myself not to turn around. But the message, that line, I'm right behind you, it wasn't just words. It felt like a presence in the room, like a hand on my shoulder or a breath on the back of my neck. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to look back at the phone. I was still gripping it tightly, but my palms were sweaty. I couldn't let go of it. Not now. Not until I figured out what was happening. The screen blinked. The dots were appearing again. Turn around. This time, the words were unmistakable. They weren't just a message anymore. They felt like a command, a pull that was urging me to turn my head and face whatever was behind me. My muscles tensed, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't do it. I couldn't face what I might find. It's not a joke. You have to look. The message came through with chilling certainty. I sat there, unmoving, staring at the text. My mind was racing, searching for an explanation, but none made sense. It was impossible, wasn't it? I was alone in my apartment. I had been since I moved in. Alex was gone. There was no way he could be here. I tried to laugh it off. Just nerves. Just my mind playing tricks. I was exhausted, overthinking things. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The air in the room shifted again, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees. The slight draft from the window was now cold, colder than it should have been. My skin prickled, and a shiver ran down my spine. My pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. I needed to check. I couldn't just sit here and wait. But I still couldn't move. Then, the screen on my phone went dark for a brief second, and my heart skipped a beat. I was about to throw the phone on the bed and run to the door when the screen flashed back on. The message was gone, replaced by a new one, sent only seconds ago. You think you're safe, but you're not. The words hit me like a physical blow. My chest tightened, and I instinctively glanced toward the door, the one I always kept locked when I was home. The sound of my own breath felt too loud in the silence, too harsh against the thick, suffocating air. I couldn't breathe. For a long moment, I sat there, staring at the phone, unable to process what was happening. My thoughts were racing, colliding with each other, none of them making any sense. But the one thing I couldn't ignore was the growing sense of unease, the pressure on my chest that made it feel like the walls were closing in. The phone buzzed again, pulling me out of my daze. The message was short this time. I'm here. I bolted upright, heart thumping in my chest. My eyes darted across the room, searching the corners. But there was nothing. Nothing but the same familiar things. The bed, the dresser, the window. No one was there. I stared at the phone again. No response came. Just silence. Was I losing my mind? But then I heard it. A faint sound, so quiet at first that I almost thought it was part of my imagination. A light tapping, like fingers brushing against the wall. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, eyes fixed on the door. The tapping stopped. And then I heard it again, but louder this time. Closer. It was coming from behind me. I knew it was stupid, but I turned around. Nothing. I felt my legs shake as I stood, the phone slipping from my hands. My breath was shallow, too quick, like I was drowning in panic. I walked slowly toward the door, checking the locks again, double-checking them in a frantic daze. They were fine, locked, like they should be. But the tapping continued, this time coming from somewhere in the room. From the walls. From inside. I reached for the handle, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, the phone buzzed again. "You can't leave." I turned to face the room one last time before opening the door. And in that split second, I saw it. A shadow, faint but undeniable, standing at the edge of my vision. It was there, and it was watching me. I froze. My heart stopped for a split second, my body paralyzed with fear. The shadow in the corner of my vision flickered for just a moment, like it was trying to stay hidden in the darkness, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't just the dim light or a trick of my mind. It was there. I tried to blink the image away, to shake off the terror creeping through my limbs, but the shadow didn't disappear. It was a figure, a presence, standing just beyond the threshold of what I could truly see. It shifted slightly, moving like it was aware of my gaze, and I felt it pull at my soul, making every muscle in my body scream for me to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave. The phone was still buzzing, incessantly vibrating on the bed, demanding attention. The message was waiting for me, taunting me, daring me to face whatever this thing was. "You can't leave." The words echoed in my mind, like a chilling chant that made my blood run cold. I had to get out. I had to get away from this place, from whatever was haunting me, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the floor, too afraid to even take a step. The shadow didn't move closer, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, as if it were silently circling me, testing my limits, waiting for the right moment to strike. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, the fear suffocating me. Every inch I moved felt like a betrayal to my senses, like I was tempting fate by showing my back to whatever this was. But I couldn't help it. The door was just a few feet away. I just needed to reach it, to escape this nightmare. The tapping came again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the room like it was coming from every direction, rattling the walls and the floor beneath me. My pulse pounded in my ears, drying out everything else. "Just go. Just go." My mind screamed. I reached out for the doorknob with trembling hands, but as my fingers brushed against the cool metal, a sudden wave of cold washed over me. The air grew thick, suffocating. And the shadow, no, not just the shadow, began to form into something more. Something real. It was standing in the doorway now. A figure, its form shifting and flickering in and out of focus, like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. The face, or what could barely be called a face, was obscured in darkness, but I felt its eyes, heavy and full of malice, drilling into me. My throat tightened, and I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My voice had been stolen. "You should have never come here." The words echoed in my mind, a voice that didn't come from my phone, but from within the very space around me. It wasn't in the air. It was in me, crawling beneath my skin, making my bones feel brittle. I turned my head slightly, unable to look away from the figure now standing inches away from the door. It didn't move closer, but it didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to crush me. I was trapped. Trapped in this room with whatever it was. And then, like a cold whisper, the message on my phone updated once more. "We've been waiting for you." I backed away from the door, still paralyzed with fear. There was no escape. Not through the door. Not through the window. Nowhere. The figure in the doorway seemed to pulse with energy, like it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every second. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that there was a logical explanation for everything. But no matter how many times I told myself that, it didn't stop the terrifying reality pressing in from all sides. I needed to think. I needed to do something. I turned my attention back to the phone in my hand, clutching it like it might be my lifeline. The message was still there, mocking me. You thought you were alone. I scrolled up, frantically searching through the conversation. But the messages were different now. They weren't the friendly, comforting words Alex used to send. They were strange, disjointed, like something where someone else was typing them. The text didn't make sense. It was like they were written from a place far removed from the person I had known. But it felt like Alex. The way the words were arranged, the way they flowed, even the occasional typo. The same patterns, the same familiar tone. And yet, they weren't his words. They couldn't be. Are you afraid? The message flashed onto the screen as if it were waiting for me to answer. I didn't want to answer. I couldn't. But I couldn't help myself. Yes. It was as if I had activated something, as though acknowledging my fear gave it power. Immediately, the temperature in the room dropped. The figure moved. No, it was sliding toward me, faster than any human could. Its form twisted, the shadows around it warping in a grotesque dance. And then, the phone buzzed once more. A new message. It's too late now. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. And I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The silence felt unnatural. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. And then, in the dark, I felt it. The weight. The pressure of someone, or something, standing right behind me. I could feel its breath on my neck. I gasped for air, my chest tightening as I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. The air was so thick, it felt like it was suffocating me. My heart thudded in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. I braced myself, hoping for a rational explanation, hoping it was just the stress of the day playing tricks on my mind. But when I finally turned around, I saw nothing. Nothing but the same empty room. My eyes darted to the corners, the shadows stretching long against the walls in the dim light. The door was still closed, the window still shut. The room hadn't changed. There was no one there. But I felt it. I felt the presence, something unseen, but undeniably close. It wasn't just in my head. The room was too still, too oppressive. My skin tingled with the sensation of being watched, like invisible eyes were tracing every movement I made. The phone buzzed again, and I almost jumped out of my skin. I grabbed it, desperate for some kind of escape, some kind of connection to reality. The screen flashed, and the next message was already waiting for me. Look behind you. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was there. I didn't even want to entertain the idea that it might be real, that whatever was in the room with me could be real. But my body moved without my consent, as if it was being dragged against its will. My head slowly turned. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beneath the window, there was a mirror. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't there earlier, not when I entered. But now, it stood tall and dark, reflecting the empty room. The glass was smooth, unmarred, except for one detail. In the reflection, there was someone standing just behind me. It wasn't my reflection. It was too distorted, the figure too vague to make out clearly. But I could see its shape, a tall, shadowy figure, like a silhouette melting into the glass. It was as if the mirror had taken on a life of its own, pulling this thing this creature from somewhere deep within the space between the world I knew and whatever realm it was trapped in. I blinked and it was gone. The mirror was just a mirror again, empty, reflecting nothing but the pale light of the room. But I knew what I had seen. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever was on the other side of that screen anymore. I didn't want to face the truth. But the phone wouldn't stop. It demanded my attention. The messages kept appearing, one after another, faster and faster, as though they were piling on top of each other. Are you scared? We're waiting for you. You can't escape. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in. The temperature dropped lower with every message, the chill creeping under my skin. I could see my breath, rising in white puffs in the air. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. I needed to do something, anything to break the cycle, to stop it from consuming me. I ran for the door, my heart pounding, but my hands were shaking so violently that I could barely turn the knob. Finally, it clicked open, and I rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The hallway was dimly lit, the air stale, and the silence was deafening. Every step I took seemed to echo, the sound of my own feet tapping against the floor too loud. The walls pressed in, the shadows in the corners shifting, as if they were alive, watching me. I made my way toward the stairs, but just as I reached the landing, I heard the unmistakable sound of a footstep behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but again, nothing. No one. The stairs were empty. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But then I felt it again, the weight, the pressure, like someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. Don't run. The message appeared on the phone again. I hadn't even realized I was still holding it in my hand, the screen glowing eerily in the dark hallway. You can't run. The voice in my head, no, it wasn't a voice anymore. It was a presence, chilled me to my core, wrapping itself around my mind, squeezing tighter with every word. The air grew heavier, colder, and as I looked back toward the stairs, the reflection in the polished surface of the banister caught my eye. The shadow was there again. It wasn't just behind me. It was with me. I could see it now, its eyes, glowing faintly from the darkness, its lips stretched in an unnatural, knowing smile. And for the first time, I felt it reach out for me. I screamed, my voice tearing through the silence of the house, but it was too late. The cold hands gripped me, pulling me into the abyss. The last thing I saw was the phone screen lighting up once more. Goodbye, friend. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been minutes. Hours. Time didn't matter anymore. My head throbbed with the remnants of something I couldn't remember, and I struggled to open my eyes. Every movement felt slow, as if I was wading through thick, heavy fog. When I finally managed to lift my head, I was lying on the cold floor of my apartment, the familiar surroundings now unfamiliar, as if they had shifted in some subtle way while I was unconscious. The air was still, thick with the kind of quiet that makes you feel trapped. I couldn't breathe normally, my chest too tight. I scanned the room quickly, looking for the mirror, the dark shape, but there was nothing. The walls were the same, the furniture was untouched. I was alone. But my phone was still in my hand, somehow, glowing faintly in the dark. The screen flickered to life as if it had a life of its own, and the familiar notifications started flooding in again. I opened my eyes wide in disbelief as I stared at the messages. They were all from the same account, the one I thought I had blocked, deleted, and moved on from. Good to see you awake. We missed you. I could feel my pulse racing, my heart hammering in my chest. It was happening again, just like before. There was a message from someone who had been gone for so long, someone I had mourned. The one I thought I'd lost forever. The name was unmistakable, Zane. He had died years ago. I had seen his obituary. I had attended the funeral. So why, how, was I seeing him now, in these messages? The words on the screen shifted, becoming more sinister with each passing second. Did you really think it was over? You can never escape us. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, to crush it with my hands. But the messages kept coming, each one more urgent, more insistent. We know you're still here. You'll never leave. The cold seemed to seep deeper into my bones, every breath coming out as a puff of mist in the air. The phone buzzed, and this time, when I looked, it was a new message. It wasn't from Zane. It was from me. The message on the screen read, "Don't look in the mirror." I froze. I could feel my breath hitching, caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. How was this possible? How could it be for me? I slowly lifted my eyes, the dread creeping back into my chest. The mirror. The same one I had tried to forget. The reflection. The shadow. It was still there. I hadn't imagined it. I could feel the heat of panic rising in my chest, but my legs were frozen. I couldn't move. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw it again. The shadow. No longer a vague form. Now, it was distinct, its features sharp, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It was standing right in front of the mirror, grinning. And I could see it clearly, as if the reflection was trying to break free of the glass, pulling itself out into my world. I turned to flee, but the phone slipped from my fingers and hit the ground with a sickening crack. The world around me seemed to collapse into darkness. And just before I lost consciousness, the last thing I saw was the message that flashed on the screen one final time. "Welcome home." Have you ever smelled something that you couldn't get rid of? Something that seemed to follow you everywhere, no matter how many times you scrubbed, cleaned, or aired out the room? That's what happened to me. I moved into a new apartment, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and relief. It was a fresh start, new city, new job, new everything. The apartment was quaint, a little older than I had imagined, but it had character. The high ceilings, the creaky wooden floors, the little balcony overlooking a quiet street. I couldn't help but think how perfect it was for me, how cozy and private. But then came the smell. At first, it was subtle, just a faint, musty odor. It lingered in the air, a reminder that the building had been around for a while. I assumed it was just the nature of old apartments. A little dust. Maybe a bit of mildew in the corners. No big deal. But every time I walked into my apartment, I would catch it again, the sharp, almost medicinal scent that seemed to cling to the walls, to the furniture, to the very air. I tried everything to get rid of it. Opened all the windows, burned candles, sprayed air fresheners. But no matter what I did, the smell came back. Every time I came home, it was there, as if it had settled into the apartment itself, refusing to leave. I began to feel like I was being suffocated by it. It wasn't just the smell. It was the weight it carried. It made the space feel oppressive, as if the apartment itself was holding some dark secret, something it was trying to tell me but couldn't. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then something strange happened. I ran into a neighbor in the hallway one evening, an older woman who lived 2 doors down. I had only spoken to her a few times, but we exchanged pleasantries as I passed by. "You've been here for a few weeks now, haven't you?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, smiling. "I really like it here." She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The smell. It's still there, isn't it?" I froze. I hadn't mentioned the smell to anyone. How did she know? "Excuse me?" I asked, forcing a polite smile. She looked around, as if to make sure no one else was listening. "The smell. It's always there in that apartment, you know. It's part of the place." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her gaze shifting towards her door. "I'm sure you've heard the story. It happened a few years ago. The woman who lived there before you, she never left." I didn't understand at first. "What do you mean she never left?" The woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "She died in there. She was found in that very apartment. Some say it was suicide, others think it was something else. But no one really knows. All I know is that the smell, it was there before, and it's still here now." I could feel my heart race as I processed her words. It couldn't be. The woman had died? And now the apartment, my apartment, was haunted by the memory of whatever had happened? "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She nodded, her expression serious. "You'll get used to it, eventually. But just remember, sometimes the past doesn't leave. Sometimes it stays. And it never really goes away." I stood there, frozen, as the woman slowly closed her door, leaving me alone in the hallway. Her words echoed in my mind, a warning I didn't want to believe. But as I turned back to my apartment, the air around me seemed colder. The smell, that ever-present scent, seemed to grow stronger, more pungent, as if it was seeping out of the walls themselves. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe the apartment had more to tell me than I was ready to hear. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign and unsettling. The smell clung to the air like a heavy fog, making it hard to breathe. I kept my windows open, hoping the night breeze would push it away, but it only seemed to intensify the scent, like the air itself was trying to remind me of its presence. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind racing with the woman's words. She never left. How could that be true? Surely, it was just a rumor. A sad story passed down by neighbors who had too much time on their hands. People like to talk, to make stories out of things they don't understand. Still, the idea lingered, like a dark shadow at the edge of my thoughts. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a sense of unease when I entered the apartment, a chill that crawled up my spine. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just nerves. I had moved to a new place, and it was natural to feel unsettled. But then, it happened again. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after breakfast, when I heard a faint sound, almost like a soft tapping. It was so quiet, I thought I might be imagining it. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap. 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 I froze, listening intently. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the pipes or the neighbors. It was coming from inside the apartment. My heart started to pound. I turned slowly, half expecting to see something or someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty kitchen, bathed in the weak morning light. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls, as if something or someone was trying to get out. The tapping continued for a few more seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. I stood there, too frightened to move, unsure of what to do. Was it the house settling? The wind? No. It wasn't any of those things. I knew that. It was something else. Something wrong. That night, I tried to focus on anything but the apartment. I went out, visited a few shops, and even walked around the neighborhood. Anything to keep my mind off the growing sense of dread I couldn't shake. But no matter where I went, the smell followed me. It wasn't as strong, but it was there. A subtle reminder, lingering like smoke on my clothes. When I returned home, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. I hesitated at the door, but then pushed it open, telling myself I was being irrational. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was different. The smell was stronger, more overwhelming than it had ever been. And there, in the corner of the hallway, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a shadow, dark, shapeless, but moving. I blinked, and it was gone. But the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in, suffocating me. The shadow, the smell, the tapping, it all seemed to be closing in, as if the apartment was alive, breathing in the same air I was. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. "Hello, Ms. Wallace?" The landlord's voice crackled through the phone. "Is everything all right?" "I need to know more about the history of this place," I said, my voice shaking. I heard some things. Is there something I should know?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then, in a quieter tone, she replied, "I've heard the stories. It's true, there was an incident a few years ago. A woman, she passed away in that apartment. It was tragic, but..." She hesitated again. "There's nothing I can do about it now. The apartment is yours, but sometimes, well, some things are best left in the past." Her words didn't comfort me. If anything, they only added to the sense of dread that was quickly consuming me. I hung up the phone and stood in the middle of the living room, feeling the weight of the silence around me. The walls felt too close, too heavy. The smell was stronger now, like it was trying to choke me. I wanted to run, to leave, but there was nowhere else to go. The apartment had become a prison, and no matter what I did, it felt like it was closing in around me. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving just beyond my line of sight. The tapping had returned, louder this time, persistent, almost impatient. And I realized something then. The apartment wasn't just haunted by the past. It was alive. And it didn't want me to forget. In the darkness, I could almost hear the woman's voice, faint and distant, as if she were whispering from the other side. "Leave," she seemed to say. "Leave before it's too late." But it was too late for me. The apartment had already claimed me, and there was no escaping it now. I tried to ignore the woman's voice, dismissing it as my mind playing tricks on me. The stress of moving, the unsettling smell, the strange noises, everything was building up, and I knew I needed to keep it together. But it was becoming impossible to pretend that nothing was wrong, The following days felt like I was living in a fog, a haze of confusion and fear. The tapping had become more frequent, and at night I could swear I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, shuffling across the hardwood floors. But when I would look, there was no one there. The shadows in the apartment seemed to stretch longer, as if they were reaching for me, pulling me into their depths. I tried to reach out to my friends, but no one had time to listen. They were all too busy with their own lives, and the few who did respond dismissed my concerns. "It's just your imagination," they said. "You're overthinking it." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain. One evening, I decided to confront the source of my fear. I had to know the truth, even if it meant facing the unimaginable. I returned to the landlord's office, determined to get more answers. She was sitting at her desk, her eyes tired, as if she had heard this story 1,000 times. "You came back," she said, her voice quiet, almost resigned. "I need to know more," I insisted. "You mentioned there was an incident here. What happened?" The landlord sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she had been carrying the weight of this secret for too long. "It was a few years ago," she began, her voice distant. "A woman named Lily. She was young, just moved in. She didn't have many friends, kept to herself mostly. One night, she was found. Dead. Alone. The police said it was an accident, but," she paused, her eyes flickering toward the door as if afraid someone might be listening. "But what?" I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. "The way she died didn't add up," the landlord whispered, her voice barely audible. "There were no signs of a struggle, no reason for it. But after she passed, people started to notice strange things. The smell, the sounds. It was as if she never left." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "So, you're saying this place is haunted?" The landlord didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Pity? Maybe both. "I don't know if I call it haunting," she said slowly. "But there's something here. I'm telling you, I've seen it myself. And others have too. It's like she's still here, watching. It's like she's waiting for something." My mind raced as I tried to process what she was saying. Was it possible? Could Lily's spirit still linger in the apartment? Or was it something else? Something worse? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I suddenly couldn't breathe. "Do you think I should leave?" I asked, barely able to speak through the lump in my throat. The landlord hesitated. "I can't tell you what to do. But I will say this, if the apartment calls to you, it's hard to leave. Some people stay. Some people," she trailed off, her voice shaking. "Some people don't make it out at all." I left the landlord's office feeling more uncertain than ever. Her words echoed in my mind as I made my way back to the apartment. What if she was right? What if this place was cursed, or worse, alive? The thought made my stomach turn, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. When I walked through the door, I was met with an overpowering stench, the smell of something rotting, something that shouldn't be in a living space. It hit me like a wave, causing me to gag. I quickly opened the windows, trying to air it out, but it didn't help. The smell lingered in the air, stubborn, refusing to leave. I stood there, feeling helpless. I needed to figure out what was going on. I needed to take control before it consumed me. That night, I stayed up late, determined to find out the truth. I took my phone out and started searching for anything about Lily's death, any mention of what had really happened. I found nothing online. No obituary, no news articles, just a vague reference on a local forum about a woman who had passed away, but nothing more. It was as if she had never existed. Frustrated, I decided to explore the apartment more thoroughly. Maybe there was something I had missed, some clue hidden in the walls or under the floorboards. As I moved from room to room, I began to notice something strange. In each corner of the apartment, the shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. They weren't just shadows anymore, they looked like shapes, like figures watching me, waiting. I stopped in front of the bedroom door. The tapping had started again, rhythmic and insistent, just beyond the walls. But this time, it wasn't just the tapping. I heard something else, whispers. Soft at first, then louder, until they filled the entire room. Leave, now, before it's too late. I froze. The voice sounded like a woman's, but it wasn't just a voice. It was the air itself, the very atmosphere around me, urging me to go. To escape. But I couldn't move. The apartment had become a cage, and I was trapped in its grip. I turned to the door, ready to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. In the hallway, there was a shadow, a figure standing just out of reach of the light. It was tall, thin, and the faintest outline of a woman could be seen. Her face was hidden in darkness, but I could feel her eyes on me. I gasped, stumbling back. My heart raced. What was it? Who was it? The whispering grew louder, and I felt a presence closing in on me. Something was coming. Something was waiting. And I was too terrified to face it. The figure in the hallway didn't move. It simply stood there, an unsettling shape in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the floor. The whispering continued, echoing in my mind, growing more insistent with each passing second. Leave now, before it's too late. My heart hammered against my chest, each beat louder than the last. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the apartment itself was alive, pressing in around me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark figure in the hallway. It was like it was waiting, watching. And the longer I stood there, the more I felt a strange pull toward it, as though it was calling me, beckoning me closer. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone, trying to call someone, anyone. But when I unlocked the screen, my thumb hovered over the contact list, unable to make the decision. The silence around me was deafening. The whispers continued, but now they seemed to be coming from everywhere, seeping from the walls, the floors, the very air itself. I slowly turned toward the figure in the hallway, unable to stop myself. The shadows around it seemed to shift and flicker, like a flame caught in the wind. The outline of the woman became clearer, though her face remained hidden in darkness. She was tall, impossibly tall, and her posture was stiff, unnatural. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. The words felt wrong, like they shouldn't have been spoken, but I couldn't help myself. It was as if the presence was drawing the words from me, coaxing me into asking. For a moment, there was no response. The figure remained motionless, its presence filling the room with a chilling weight. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure's head tilted to the side. The movement was so subtle, so deliberate, it sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to take a step back, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the floor had turned to stone beneath me, holding me in place. The whispering grew louder, swirling around me, filling my mind with dark thoughts. I couldn't think clearly. My body felt heavy, like the very air was pressing down on me, suffocating me. Leave, now! The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a demand. The figure's silhouette seemed to stretch, distorting and elongating as if something was pushing against the fabric of the room itself. A cold gust of wind swept through the apartment, slamming the windows shut with a force that made me jump. The smell, that terrible, rotting smell, returned, stronger than ever. It filled my nostrils, choking me. I fought the urge to vomit, but it was almost impossible to ignore. Who are you? I managed to choke out again, my voice barely audible. The figure in the hallway took a step forward. One slow, deliberate step. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath now, visible in front of me like a ghost in the night. My pulse quickened, my body screaming at me to run, but my feet refused to move. The figure spoke. Its voice was hollow, distant, as if it were speaking from far away. I am her. I am Lily. The name hit me like a bolt of lightning. My mind reeled as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The woman from the landlord's story. The woman who had died in the apartment, alone, in silence. But why was she here now? Why was her presence still lingering? The figure's face remained hidden in the darkness, but the voice grew clearer. I have waited for someone to hear me, for someone to understand. I took a shaky step forward, my hands trembling at my sides. I couldn't look away. Something in me, something deep inside, urged me to get closer. What happened to you? I whispered, the words slipping from my lips without thinking. The figure's head tilted again, but this time its outline seemed to blur, as if it was fading in and out of existence. I was alone. No one cared. No one knew. But now you know. The shadows around the figure swelled, pressing against the walls, as if they were alive, hungry. I felt a pull, an unexplainable tug in my chest, urging me to go toward it. To listen, to understand. But fear held me in place. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my throat dry and tight. The air seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The whispers returned, louder now, filling every inch of the apartment until it felt like my skull would crack open under the pressure. I want to be free, the figure responded, its voice now cracking, as if it were on the verge of tears. I want you to understand. I want you to know what I felt. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make sense of any of this. The smell, the whispers, the figure in the hallway, it was all too much. The apartment felt like it was closing in on me, squeezing the life out of me, and I was helpless to stop it. Suddenly, the figure lurched forward, its shape distorting, stretching unnaturally, and in that moment, I realized the truth. Lily's presence wasn't just haunting the apartment, she was the apartment. I felt something sharp in my chest, a coldness spreading through me. The air was suffocating, and my vision blurred. My body swayed, and I couldn't tell where the shadows ended and I began. The world seemed to be slipping away from me, and in the distance, I heard the woman's voice again, clearer than ever. Come with me. Be with me. Forever. In that moment, I knew what she wanted. But I was no longer sure if I was strong enough to resist. I blinked, trying to clear the fog that clouded my mind. The woman's voice echoed in my ears, a sound that now seemed to merge with the very pulse of the apartment. Every corner, every crack in the walls, Every inch of the floor felt like it was alive, breathing, waiting for something. Waiting for me. Come with me, forever. The whisper twisted inside my head like a needle, sharp and insistent. My legs trembled beneath me, my body frozen as the room seemed to shift around me. The shadows in the hallway grew darker, their edges blurring into shapes that didn't quite belong. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I was losing myself in this apartment, in this strange, suffocating presence that had taken hold of me. The cold gust of air swept through the room again, this time knocking over a vase on the table. The crash shattered the silence, but it didn't break the hold of the whispers. It only seemed to make them louder, more desperate. I could feel the presence of Lily growing stronger, as if her desperation was turning into something tangible, something real. She was pulling me in. My mind screamed at me to escape, to run out the door and never look back. But my feet refused to move. It was as if something inside me, something deeper than fear, was keeping me in place. No. The thought was a faint whisper, a final plea, buried beneath the weight of everything else. I wasn't ready to give in. I didn't want to be part of whatever twisted existence this place had become. But then, something shifted in the air, like a door slowly creaking open in the distance, drawing my attention. It was a faint sound, almost imperceptible, but in that instant, I knew exactly what it was, the sound of the past. I turned toward the source, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, standing at the edge of the living room, was the faintest outline of a door I had never noticed before. It wasn't like any door I had ever seen in the apartment. This one was different. It was small, weathered, and old, its frame barely visible in the dim light. But somehow, it felt like it had always been there, waiting for me to see it. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but there was a new urgency in them. Don't go. Stay with me. Please. I felt a chill wash over me, but it wasn't from the air. It was something inside me, deep in my bones, telling me that if I stayed, if I chose her, I would never escape. I knew I had to make a choice. Stay and face whatever dark fate awaited me in Lily's suffocating presence, or leave and step into the unknown, even if I didn't know what lay beyond that door. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the strength I had left. My body screamed in protest, every instinct telling me to give in, to surrender. But my will, fragile as it was, refused to bend. I was not her. With shaking hands, I turned away from the figure in the hallway, away from the suffocating whispers. Every step I took toward that mysterious door felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. The air seemed to tighten around me, trying to pull me back, but I kept moving forward. The door creaked open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me, and a cold, unfamiliar light spilled into the room. It wasn't the warm light of a lamp or the faint glow of the evening sun. It was pure, sterile light, something unnatural. I didn't hesitate. I stepped through. The moment I crossed the threshold, the apartment disappeared. The walls, the shadows, the suffocating presence of Lily, all had vanished, like a bad dream dissipating with the first light of morning. I found myself standing in a long, narrow hallway, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and flickering bulbs. But it wasn't the hallway of the apartment. The air was cleaner here, though still thick with something I couldn't place. The echoes of the whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I could still feel the pull of the apartment, like an invisible string tugging at my chest, trying to drag me back. But I kept walking. And then, I saw it. At the end of the hallway, a large mirror stood against the wall. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what it might show me. But I couldn't stop myself. My eyes were drawn to it like a magnet. I stepped closer, my reflection staring back at me, but it wasn't quite right. The woman I saw in the mirror was me, but her eyes were empty. I gasped, stumbling backward. The reflection didn't move, didn't blink. But it was as if it knew me, as if it understood something I didn't. And then I understood. The hallway wasn't just a hallway. It was a trap. A limbo, a place between two worlds. And I was stuck here, forever. I had left the apartment, but I had never really escaped. Lily was still with me, watching from the other side of the mirror, her cold presence following me into the new darkness. There was no escape, and no way to forget. Have you ever gotten a call that just doesn't seem right? A call where something about it feels off, even though everything seems normal? What would you do if you kept getting these calls, day after day, all asking for someone you've never heard of? I started getting these calls a few weeks ago. At first, I thought it was just a wrong number. Happens all the time, right? Someone dials the wrong digits and, well, no harm done. But these calls were different. It always started the same way. The phone would ring, I'd pick up, and the voice on the other end would ask, "Is this the number for Alex?" Every time I said, "No, you've got the wrong number," they'd apologize and hang up. Simple. No harm done. At least, that's what I thought. But after a few days, the calls started to come more often. Sometimes, they'd come multiple times a day, and I'd always say the same thing: "This is not Alex's number. You've got the wrong person." But the weird part wasn't the frequency of the calls. It was the voice. It sounded familiar. Like I had heard it before, but I couldn't place it. It was a calm, polite voice, nothing too alarming, but it kept me on edge. It was almost as though they were expecting me to know who Alex was. The voice always sounded the same, like it was a pre-recorded message. After a while, I started dreading my phone ringing, knowing it was just another call for this mysterious Alex. Sometimes, I'd be tempted to ignore it, but something inside me always urged me to answer. The voice was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a nagging feeling I had to get rid of. One evening, after several more calls, I decided to do something different. I couldn't explain why, but I was getting sick of it. I wanted to know who Alex was. I wanted to know why they kept calling me. So, I decided to call the number back. I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialed the number that had been showing up on my screen for days, and held my breath as the phone rang. I expected to hear a generic voicemail, something like, "Sorry, I'm not available right now," but that's not what happened. A voice answered after just one ring. It was the same voice, calm and polite, just like the others. But there was something strange about the way they spoke. It wasn't just the voice, it was the tone, the way the words flowed. "Hello," the voice said, a slight pause before continuing. "Is this Alex?" I froze. The voice, my voice. I couldn't believe it. It was me. It sounded like my voice, but not quite. It was like listening to an echo of myself. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I felt an odd chill creep through me. The connection between me and this voice, this other version of me, was unnerving. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My hand was shaking, still holding the phone to my ear. It felt like I wasn't in control of the conversation anymore. "I'm looking for Alex," the voice repeated, not answering my question, as if it didn't even acknowledge what I had just asked. "You have the wrong number." I stared at the phone in my hand, the words still echoing in my head. Was this some kind of prank? But it didn't feel like one. The voice on the other end wasn't joking, it wasn't messing around, it felt like it was me, but not me. It was too real, too familiar. "Why are you calling me?" I demanded, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. But there was only silence. I waited, heart pounding in my chest, but no one responded. I tried again, pressing the phone harder to my ear. "Hello?" I asked again, more firmly this time. "Who is this? What do you want?" But the voice didn't answer. Instead, I heard a faint click, as though the line had disconnected. The call ended. I stood there, still holding the phone, staring at the screen in disbelief. The number that had called me was still on the screen, but something was wrong. It wasn't the same number I had been dialing. It had changed, shifted in an almost imperceptible way, as if it had never been the same number to begin with. I felt a cold sweat creeping down my back. What had just happened? How could it have sounded like my own voice? I had to know more. This couldn't just be a coincidence. The next day, I tried calling the number back again, but when I dialed, I was met with a message, a mechanical voice telling me the number was no longer in service. That was the moment I knew something was very wrong. And it was just the beginning. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the call, the voice, my voice. It was as if a part of me had slipped away, something intangible yet so very real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Maybe it was just paranoia, but I had a sense of unease creeping into my every thought, my every action. I tried to go about my usual routine, work, errands, normal stuff. But every time I saw my phone, I hesitated. The fear that another call would come, another conversation with that voice, kept me on edge. And then, on the fourth day, it came. The phone rang, and my heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, the same number, the number that hadn't existed anymore, flashing across it. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But I had to know. I couldn't leave it hanging in the air like this, the mystery consuming me. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound calm. "Hello, is this Alex?" The voice, so eerily familiar, came through the speaker. I felt my blood run cold. "I told you before," I said, trying to remain steady. "This is not Alex. You have the wrong number. Who are you? Why are you calling me?" There was a slight pause before the voice spoke again, a tone of slight confusion in its words. "I don't understand. This is Alex's number, right? You are Alex, aren't you?" A chill crawled down my spine. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "No, I'm not Alex." I nearly shouted into the phone. "You've got the wrong person. I don't know who Alex is." The voice on the other end hesitated. "This is strange," it said softly, as if it was confused. "I've been trying to reach Alex. I've been waiting. You know, you promised me you would help." My breath hitched in my throat. Help? What was this? The voice sounded like mine, but it wasn't me. It felt like it was playing with my mind, twisting my memories, making me question everything. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking now, a pit of dread settling in my stomach. "Who are you?" The silence that followed felt longer than it should have. It stretched out like a slow, suffocating vacuum, pulling every ounce of air from my lungs. Finally, the voice spoke again, almost in a whisper. "I'm you." The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. "I'm you." The sentence made no sense, but it was there, echoing in my mind like a riddle I couldn't solve. I opened my mouth to speak, but the voice continued, cutting me off. "Don't be afraid," it said softly. "I just need you to remember." And then, before I could say another word, the call abruptly ended. The line went dead with a soft, mechanical click. I sat there for a moment, the phone still pressed against my ear. My hand felt frozen, stuck in place as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I was gasping for air, my mind racing. What was this? What had just happened? Was I losing my grip on reality? I tried calling the number back again, but this time it went straight to voicemail. No message, no automated voice. Just silence. I felt trapped. My mind was swirling with possibilities, none of them comforting. I didn't know who to trust. Was it me? Was I somehow speaking to a different version of myself? A darker version that was trying to pull me into something I couldn't understand? I had to get answers. So, I decided to search for Alex. Whoever this person was, I had to find out. Maybe they were real. Maybe this was just a bizarre coincidence. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that something was wrong with every lead I followed. Every search for Alex led to dead ends, empty profiles, and unanswered questions. No one seemed to know anything about this Alex. The name didn't exist anywhere. I started to wonder if I was looking for a person at all, or if I was searching for a ghost. And then, one evening, as I sat staring at my computer screen, a new message popped up on my phone. It was from the same number. "Don't look for me anymore," it read. "You already know everything you need to know. You are Alex." The hairs on my neck stood up as the message sank in. It felt like something had shifted. Like something invisible, yet very real, had crossed a line. I wasn't sure anymore. I didn't know who I was supposed to be anymore. The weight of the message lingered in my chest like a cold stone. "You are Alex." The words gnawed at me, echoing in my mind with an almost oppressive force. My head throbbed with confusion and dread. Who was I really? How was this happening? What did it all mean? I spent the following days in a haze, unable to shake the grip of uncertainty that had seized me. The lines between what was real and what was not had begun to blur. I felt detached from everything around me. The world seemed to move in slow motion, as if I were watching life through a fogged window. The usual hum of everyday life, the mundane sounds of traffic, of people talking, everything felt muffled, distant. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another message. But there was nothing. It was as if the world had fallen silent around me, leaving only the unresolved mystery of Alex. One evening, unable to take the stillness any longer, I decided to leave my apartment. I grabbed my coat, half-heartedly shoved my phone into my pocket, and stepped out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The familiar sounds of the city, car engines, people laughing, the occasional shout, were strangely absent. Only the distant hum of the streetlights filled the air. I walked for what felt like hours, lost in my thoughts, my feet carrying me without any real direction. It wasn't until I found myself standing in front of a small alleyway that I realized where I was. The apartment complex where I lived was just around the corner, hidden behind a maze of narrow streets and forgotten paths. Something drew me to the alley. I couldn't explain why, but there it was, a pull, subtle but undeniable. As I walked deeper into the shadowed passage, I felt a chill crawl over my skin. The alley was suffocatingly quiet, the only sounds my footsteps echoing off the walls. My breath quickened, and I glanced around, feeling as though someone, or something, was watching me. At the end of the alley, a small, run-down door stood ajar. It looked like an old storage space, forgotten and abandoned. The faintest glimmer of light leaked from the crack, barely visible but enough to catch my attention. Before I could think twice, my hand reached out and pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled stale, heavy with dust and something else, something vaguely familiar. I stepped into the dimly lit room, squinting as my eyes adjusted. The place was cluttered with old furniture, boxes stacked haphazardly, and yellowed photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. But it wasn't the room itself that caught my attention. It was the large mirror that stood against the far wall. The mirror was framed in dark wood, its edges worn and chipped with age. But the most unsettling thing was the reflection, or rather, the lack of it. I should have been able to see myself, but there was nothing. Just the dim limb behind me, an empty void where my reflection should have been. I took a step forward, my heart racing. I raised a hand to the glass, my fingers trembling as they hovered just inches from the surface. My breath fogged up the mirror, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, someone, in the glass, moving just out of the corner of my eye. I whipped around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, I saw it. A figure. It wasn't quite me, but it was close, too close. The shape in the mirror was a reflection of me, but the eyes, they were different. They were hollow, dark, and seemed to stare directly into my soul. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, but the figure remained. It grinned, just slightly, as if it knew something I didn't. I couldn't look away. My feet felt rooted to the spot, and my eyes were locked on the reflection. I felt as though something inside me was being pulled, as if the mirror were reaching out, trying to draw me in. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut, the sound like a clap of thunder. I spun around, panic rising in my chest, but when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. There was nothing there, only my own wide-eyed reflection, staring back at me with a look of utter disbelief. I staggered backward, my mind reeling. What was happening to me? Was this the real Alex? Or was it me, losing myself piece by piece? I stumbled out of the room, my legs shaky beneath me. The door opened with a squeal, and I fled into the cold night air, gasping for breath. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran down the alley, desperate to get away from whatever it was that had just happened. I had no answers. Only more questions, more confusion. When I returned home, I locked the door behind me and sank onto the couch, my hands still shaking. The silence of the apartment was deafening. My phone sat on the table, silent, waiting. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to hear that voice again. But in the back of my mind, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The mirror, the voice, the constant reminder that I was Alex, everything was a thread, unraveling before me, pulling me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. I closed my eyes, hoping it was all a bad dream. But deep down, I knew better. This was real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every moment since I'd left the alley, every step felt heavier than the last. The silence in my apartment was suffocating, as though it was pressing down on me from all directions. I couldn't look at the mirror anymore without the chill creeping up my spine. Every reflection felt like it was hiding something I wasn't supposed to see. I spent the next few days in a daze. I avoided the alley, the mirror, and my phone. But the silence didn't help. It only deepened the sense that I was being watched, followed by an invisible presence that never left me. Then it happened again. I was lying in bed one evening, the darkness of the room surrounding me like a blanket. I had managed to shut out the nagging feeling for a little while, but it was creeping back in. The low hum of my refrigerator, the distant sounds of traffic outside, nothing seemed real anymore. My phone lay on the nightstand, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. I hadn't looked at it all day, but it sat there, taunting me with its quiet presence. I reached over, hesitated, then unlocked the screen. There was a message. It was from an unknown number, one I didn't recognize. The message was short but chilling. "I know you're there, Alex." My stomach dropped. I stared at the words, disbelief washing over me. It wasn't just the message that rattled me, it was the name. Alex. The same name. The same identity I'd been questioning for days. I swallowed hard and tried to push away the unease creeping up my throat. My fingers moved almost of their own accord, dialing the unknown number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, faster with each passing second. My palms were slick with sweat. I didn't know why I was doing this, why I had picked up the phone in the first place. But curiosity and fear seemed to fight for control over me. Then, the call connected. A breath. Then a voice. It was me. At least, it sounded like me. The voice was distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker. But it was unmistakably my own. My voice, only somehow wrong. "Hello, Alex?" The voice rasped. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. There was something almost familiar about it. Something terrifyingly familiar. What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. My throat felt dry. The voice on the other end paused, as if considering my question, before answering. "You know what I want, Alex. I've always been here. I've always been you." I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the world had tilted just slightly. My stomach churned. My mind raced. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I'm not you." The voice chuckled, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. "Oh, but you are." The words were so simple, but they carried in weight an undeniable truth that felt too big to deny. "I'm you, and you're me. We are the same." I pulled the phone away from my ear, holding it at arm's length. The room around me seemed to close in. My mind was screaming, trying to reject what the voice was saying. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel the truth of it. A creeping sense of familiarity gnawed at me, as if a part of me had always known this was coming. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my shaking hands. "Why now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, then the voice responded with a softness that was almost comforting. "Because you're finally ready to see." I didn't know what that meant. I didn't want to know. But before I could ask another question, the line went dead. I stared at the phone screen, still buzzing faintly with the remnants of the call. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the room seemed to press in on me, the walls closing in. I felt dizzy, my mind racing in 1,000 directions. I couldn't focus. I needed to do something, anything, to stop this feeling, to make it all stop. But when I looked in the mirror that night, the reflection staring back at me wasn't my own. Or at least, it wasn't the one I had come to know. The eyes in the mirror were different. There was something cold in them now, something that wasn't me. The figure in the glass grinned, and my heart skipped a beat. The mirror had become a doorway, a portal to something I couldn't escape. I was no longer sure if I was Alex, or if Alex had always been me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but the voice still echoed in my head, lingering in the silence. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was trapped. Trapped in a story I didn't understand. And I had no way out. The days blurred together after the phone call. I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had shifted. The voice, my voice, echoed in my mind relentlessly. I'm you, and you're me. It haunted me. Every corner of my apartment felt suffocating, as though the walls were slowly closing in. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my reflection in the mirror, no longer just a face I recognized, but something else, something that had taken root in my mind. I would stare at it, searching for the person I used to know, but all I saw was the same cold, unfamiliar gaze staring back. I tried to forget. I tried to distract myself, to put distance between myself and the strange events. I even left my apartment for a while, walking through the streets aimlessly, hoping the air outside would clear my thoughts. But no matter where I went, the feeling followed. The air was thick with the same unease that had started in my apartment. At some point, I realized there was no escaping it. The more I tried to ignore the problem, the more it consumed me. I couldn't focus on anything. My work, my friends, they all seemed distant, like I was living someone else's life, someone else's story. The person I had been was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know who was taking my place. I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. One night, unable to sleep again, I stood before the mirror in my apartment. I stared at my reflection, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stop myself from wondering, was I seeing the real me? Or was it him? The person I was becoming? Or the person I had always been? The reflection grinned again, and I froze. The smile wasn't mine. It was colder, sharper. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just looking at a person who resembled me. I was looking at a version of myself that was not me at all. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt as if I was losing myself. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening to me. I grabbed my phone, almost without thinking, and dialed the number again, the same number from the mysterious call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring like a hammer striking my skull. Then, it picked up. The voice was there again. My voice. Alex, it whispered, like it had been waiting for me. I told you, we are the same. No, I said, my voice breaking. No, you're not me. You're not real. The reflection in the mirror didn't change. It didn't respond to my words, but the grin grew wider, and a flicker of movement caught the corner of my eye. It wasn't just smiling now, it was watching me. waiting for me to say the right words, to do the right thing. The voice on the phone continued, a soft, eerie laugh escaping it. It's too late to deny it now. You're becoming me. And I'm becoming you. There's no going back. I felt something snap inside me. My body shook with the force of it. I wasn't sure if I was still talking to myself or if someone else had taken control. I had to escape. I had to get out of this apartment, away from the reflection, away from the voice that sounded too familiar, too close. I hung up the phone, but the words didn't leave me. I stumbled back, turning my gaze away from the mirror. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pulled back in, that I was sinking into something I couldn't understand. I rushed out of my apartment, desperate to put distance between myself and the nightmare that had become my reality. But as I stepped outside, I looked up at the buildings around me. Everything seemed the same. The streets, the lights, the people walking past. Nothing was different. Except me. I had become a stranger in my own life. And that stranger, that voice, that reflection, they were still with me. And they were waiting. The question wasn't whether I would escape anymore. The question was, who was I escaping from? And would I ever find out? Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.